We're live, I think. Yeah.
Excellent.
We're live, Alexander. How are you?
I'm very well. I would say flourishing. In fact, a bit tired because obviously I have now family responsibilities, if I can put it like that. But extremely well. A situation where I'm well and things are going personally well, but where as you correctly said in the title to this video, and we are seeing a really difficult, increasingly difficult picture. And what's so extraordinary about it is that it's on almost every front now. I mean, it's economic, it's geopolitical, and it's governmental, it seems to me. So all of this thing is happening all at the same time. And there doesn't seem to be much understanding on the part of the leaderships of the West of what exactly they're doing and where they're going. We'll see. We'll see what happens this winter.
Yeah, hence the title, Dark Winter, which is a broad kind of subject, which you'll get into. So you'll talk about that as we go forward. Hence the thumbnail that I used, the picture, which is Nancy Pelosi eating that $20 ice cream. I don't know if you remember that. It was like about a year and a half ago, where she was bragging about the $20 ice cream that she has in her refrigerator. And I just stumbled upon that image, and I thought, well, let them eat cake, let them eat ice cream. I guess it's, it kind of sums up the situation in that they just, not only do they not care, it's just kind of, they're flaunting their privilege, their elitism. I don't know how to properly put it, but I just saw that thumbnail and I was like, okay, well, this kind of sums up the situation around the world in a variety of different scenarios, whether we're going to talk about energy or the Build Back Better vote in the House of Representatives, which took place the other day, whether we're going to talk about Rittenhouse or Austria and lockdowns, or Ireland and Varadkar and his 95%. The 5% are ruining it for us. And I mean, Boris Johnson and everything going on in the UK. He's kind of going after Russia again. Anyway, there's a lot to get to, Alexander. So I want to say hello, first of all. We want to say hello, first of all, to everybody that is joining us from everywhere in the world, wherever you are. Thank you very much for spending your Friday with us. And we're going to get to a lot of news topics. And I'm going to pass it off to you, Alexander, in 1 minute. Let me just say hello to our awesome moderators. And I am seeing in the house, we have all the moderators are great. So we have the great Valies, we have the great Cosmic Rain, the great Zarael, fantastic video on locals, by the way. Well done there. And we have the one and only Spartan Warrior Queen is also in the house. And the legend Alan Watson is with us as well. And let me see if I missed any of the moderators, Alexander. I think I got all of them. Yes, I did. So thank you to our moderators for keeping everything moving and keeping the chat alive and keeping it clean. And Alexander, Dark Winter. What is going to make this winter dark? Choose your subject, choose your region, choose your topic. Alexander, what do you think? Dark Winter, where, when, who, what?
Well, indeed. Well, let's first of all start with the thing that's global, that's affecting every part of the world now, and is going to create problems everywhere, but which has, in my opinion, its single source. And that is the inflation. The inflation crisis is now deepening, and it's expanding to every region. I mean, to be straightforward about it, China's affected by it. Russia's very affected by it, particularly bitter for them because they've been trying extremely hard to bring inflation under control for the last 6 or so years, and they succeeded, or so it seemed. And now, because of this worldwide inflation crisis, they've seen inflation go up again in their own country. But of course, that's Russia, and that's in one place. But it is everywhere. It is affecting everybody. It is, I suspect, in most places now, it's already reached double-digit levels. When I say most places, I mean outside, if you like, the developed world, to use that incredibly patronizing and condescending word to describe some countries as opposed to others. But outside the developed world, in the global south, I suspect most of those places, they're now well into double-digit inflation. And I received, as I said, a private message from an acquaintance of mine who briefs members of Congress, and he said that the problems are going to get worse, partly because there is now a surge in energy costs. There is a worldwide shortage of natural gas. We're going to come to that in a short time. Natural gas is increasingly being used to provide heating, which is one thing, of course, it's used for. But because natural gas is being just the limited amounts of natural gas which are available are being used for heating, not enough natural gas is being used to produce fertilizer for food, and it's the single major ingredient in producing fertilizer. And the Russians, who are the major exporters of liquefied natural gas that's used for that purpose, are apparently restricting exports because they need it for their own conditions in their own country. The problem they would run is, because of rising global prices, the concern is that it's more profitable for Russian ammonia and liquefied natural gas producers to sell their product overseas than in Russia itself. And to prevent that and to try to get a grip on inflation, the Russians are quietly imposing export controls. But that, of course, simply exports the problem elsewhere. And that will lead, it seems, quite plausibly, to another massive surge in food prices across the world, because not enough or not as much food will be produced next year as has been produced historically. So we are going to see a big worldwide inflation problem, and that's going to start before very long to have major political consequences. And as I've discussed many times in many programs, the reason we have worldwide inflation is because the new administration has not only taken the brake off the monetary and fiscal accelerator, it is pushing it ever further down. They're now passed yet another bill through Congress for more spending, Build Back Better and all of this. And already one can sense that this is creating even heightened inflation expectations. There seems to be a dogmatic unwillingness to accept this. I get the sense that even Republicans in Congress don't seem to grasp the enormity and danger of what they're doing. I think we've lived in a world where consumer price inflation has been under control for so long that people don't understand, policymakers in the West don't understand how dangerous the policies that they are pursuing are. And when I say the West, I mean principally and primarily the United States. Now, there's going to be political consequences. There's going to be political consequences in the United States as well. We're already seeing, I've seen the latest opinion polls, which show a massive Republican blowout win in the midterms next year. But that's the United States. In Europe, it's going to be worse. In the global South, when food prices rise, when energy costs rise, people become radicalized. People are already living to a great extent on the margins. We could very well see a crisis of instability across the global South, which could, of course, make the economic problems even greater if it affects supply chains even more. So we have a running problem there. Then, on top of that, we're now starting to see the extraordinary consequences of the energy policies that we've been following across the West. I mean, there's been this decision to move away from fossil fuels. The people who are demanding it are not slackening off on that. I read an article by an important journalist here, George Monbiot, who is very keen on this. He says, that we have to stop using fossil fuels entirely by 2030. I mean, a utopian fantasy, but it embodies the drive that you still see coming in the West. The result is because nuclear power is something that these people have historically opposed, and of course it takes a very long time to build nuclear power stations, we see an overinvestment, as it's turned out, in unreliable technologies, which are not producing enough heating and power generation this winter. And that's not just true in Europe, it's true in the United States as well. The United States is now steadily moving away from that position which it briefly achieved of becoming an oil and gas exporter. It's starting to import oil and gas again. Partly that's for geological reasons, partly it's also for policy reasons too. So, and of course in Europe, the situation is much worse. And I was reading a very disturbing articles, both in the Financial Times and in the Daily Telegraph in Britain. We're now talking about rolling blackouts across Europe this winter being a real possibility, with the situation apparently getting worse. And to get a sense of how bad they are, natural gas reserves in Europe are now lower than they were just 2 weeks ago. So instead of natural gas reserves being increased to prepare for the winter, they are actually falling because, of course, we need to keep heating going. And the politics of this are utterly bizarre. On the one hand, we see a continued resistance to Nord Stream 2, even though I'm not saying Nord Stream 2 is the solution to all these problems, but at least it would help. But there's still a desire to make the certification of Nord Stream 2 as complicated as possible. So now the earliest date that that's likely to start to come online is the summer. So, I mean, it's not going to help Europe through the winter. And we see crazy comments like those of the British Prime Minister Boris Johnson about, choose between cheap gas from Russia or Ukraine. I mean, the logical answer to that, you think about it, is you choose cheap natural gas. You keep your lights and your heating going. I mean, that's what most people, I think, in Europe, if it were posed to them in that way, that's how they would answer that. Whether Boris Johnson understands that, I don't know. But it again reflects the mindset. And of course, on top of all of this, there's the geopolitics of it. I mean, you have, I've been reading some utterly crazy articles now circulating in the American and British media. There was one by a man called Nikolai Gvozdtsev, who, despite his name, is actually American in national interest, saying that Putin is responsible for everything. He's responsible for the inflation. He's responsible for the energy shortages across Europe. He's responsible for the growing crises in the Balkans, which you haven't really touched on. He's responsible for Ukraine, the migrant crisis, everything. He is somehow responsible. The same stories are now appearing in the British media too. So we're seeing a credible ratcheting up on geopolitical tensions. And we've also seen how the new foreign policy team in the White House is failing at everything they undertake. So they've had a virtual summit with Xi Jinping, which didn't achieve any actual positives, but might have acted to stabilize the situation. They've already, I think, undermined the prospects of that by spinning a story that Xi Jinping agreed to talks on nuclear arms control, which the Chinese have now made absolutely clear he never did. And we've also seen that the diplomacy over Ukraine has now completely unraveled, with the Europeans and the Americans trying to trick the Russians into direct talks with the Ukrainians, cutting out the two republics of the Donbass. And the Russians have said, enough's enough. We're not going to negotiate with you about this anymore, because from our point of view, you can't be trusted. And there's also been enormous anger at the way in which the Europeans stupidly tried to play Putin and Lavrov off against each other. A crazy idea, if ever there was one. So we have a darkening picture. Now, I haven't even started with the pandemic. We were promised at the start of the year that this was all under control, that, all these rollouts were going to achieve the results, and this is going to 2021. was going to be the end of it. Instead, what we learn is that there's going to be more restrictions, more lockdowns. They're spreading right across the world. And on top of that, there's now a drive to make treatments compulsory. And of course, Austria has actually gone ahead and has made that they're going to do that in a compulsory legal way. So the problem with doing all of this, I mean, there are many problems with doing all of this, but after people were led to think that at the start of this year that there was light at the end of the tunnel, imposing it in this kind of way is, of course, going to have enormous demoralizing effects across the developed world. And by the way, again, this is a universal phenomenon. It's not part of one country or another. We're going to see it accelerating everywhere. So there's a famous quote by the British Foreign Minister, Sir Edward Grey, on the eve of the First World War. He said that the lights are going out across Europe. We're not going to see them coming back on again in our lifetime. That's what he said, as the First World War started. This was said in August 1914. One always gets the sense that something rather more literal is going to happen this winter. The lights are going out, not just across Europe, but across much of the world. Prices are rising, restrictions are growing. The political leaders in the West seem to have little sense of what they're doing. And when they try things, they try schoolboy tactics towards China and Russia, which of course predictably backfire.
Well, they're going to have to blame someone for everything. So it looks like that is going to be Putin and Russia. I mean, I think that's obvious at this point in time. All the blame is going to be put on Putin. But isn't it interesting that going back to Boris Johnson, that he doesn't realize how out of touch he is with the citizens of the UK to actually pose a question like that? All citizens of the United Kingdom, what do you choose? Do you choose to help Ukraine, or would you rather have lights on in your home and heating? Which do you choose, citizens of Ukraine? Everyone of the UK, everyone in the UK, which would you choose? One for lights and energy and heating, or to help Ukraine? I mean, what a dumb question, but it just shows how damn out of touch he is.
Yes, I know. Absolutely. And I have to say that's reflective of the political class everywhere in the West now. As I said, they don't, I mean, it's so weird. It shows such a complete disconnection from the lives of most people. It was such a bizarre comment that I know one person who suggested to me that Boris, who's a curious person in some ways, was actually opening up the issue. He was actually trying to sort of beat a retreat on the Russia question. He actually went on in those words to talk about Russia as this great country and that we're not really opposed to them. And that when he was talking about, the choice between natural gas and Ukraine, what he was actually leading up to was perhaps we should choose cheap natural gas. I'm afraid I think that's too subtle for Boris. It's certainly too subtle for the British government at the moment. I'm afraid we have to read his words as saying exactly what they seem to mean. I think he really does think that, we can stop having Russian imported gas from Russia. And this is somehow going to be, we somehow going to get by without all that natural gas. I read an article of the Daily Telegraph in which there was even a suggestion there that Europe should simply stop tomorrow importing natural gas from Russia. I mean, no explanation of what alternative, what you do to take its place. I mean, liquefied natural gas from the United States is not heading to Europe. To the extent that it exists, it's going to Asian markets. That doesn't seem the same, by the way, is true for the Gulf. Zelensky, no less, has actually tried to speak to the UAE and Qatar about importing liquefied natural gas from the Gulf states. And of course, what he's finding is that he's up against the Asian buyers who are able to offer far more than he can do. So, I mean, there just doesn't seem to be any real grasp of what all this means, and that you just switch off the gas pipelines that are providing you with gas, well, there will be consequences to pay. I mean, it's very odd to see people like this talking in effect about sanctioning themselves, because that's what it would amount to, or sanctioning their own people, perhaps more
exactly
practically.
Consequences for their people. But for Boris Johnson, he's thinking, I'll have energy, I'll have heating, I'll be able to get on a plane, I'll be able to drive my car, but everybody else, eat bugs, put on your Zuckerberg virtual reality glasses, enter the metaverse, and be happy. That's the message to everybody. Alexander, Austria, lockdown across the whole country. They actually came out with an announcement on Thursday evening, and they said two regions, two provinces were going to do a lockdown. And then they came back on Friday morning. They said, you know what? Screw it. The whole country under lockdown. Meanwhile, the Varadkar is in, I believe, Abu Dhabi at a CNN conference. And for him, nothing but 100% is going to do, because while 95% of Ireland is jabbed up, that 5% is causing all the problem. So, I mean, the new model is 100% now.
Oh,
and
absolutely.
if you don't get to 100%, then you're going into lockdown. I mean, is that the message now?
Well, I think it is, actually, and I think that what that amounts to is, of course, you make it compulsory, and I fully predict that within a few months it will be compulsory everywhere. I mean, that is the drift, and it will. And when I say everywhere, I mean pretty much everywhere. I mean China, I mean Russia, I mean everywhere,
Except the US.
Except the US. Exactly. The US would be, exactly. The US would be massively problematic. But that is the direction of travel. Certainly it's the direction of travel in Europe. Now, of course, you make it compulsory and it still doesn't work. Remember, people were told at the start of this year that, if you got to 60% or 80%, it would solve the problem. If it still doesn't work, well, what do? I mean, do you say, well, it never happened? Do you switch off, or do you find something else? I mean, I don't
booster
know.
One, booster two,
well, I
booster
know.
three,
I know. I mean, I'm not. I don't want to look too far forward. What I will say is that there is a massive sense of letdown and demoralization, certainly in Britain, over this. I should say Britain, by the way, is still things are relatively easy and free here. We haven't gone down. We're not anywhere near the same tough restrictions that you find in places like Austria, but I'm sure they're going to come. There's already people talking about the need for them. Johnson himself would probably want to oppose it, but I wonder how far he would be able to hold out. So I think we're heading in the same direction.
Now we understand why getting rid of Kurz was so important.
Absolutely, yeah.
I mean, he was even the 10% pushback that he would give to the EU was too much to risk.
It was far too much to risk. Anyway, I mean, but as I said, that is the direction of travel. So an inflation crisis, a energy crisis, a crisis of restrictions, and of course a geopolitical crisis as well, because things in Eastern Europe are going from bad to worse. And I'm already getting the sense that the virtual summit meeting between Xi and Biden, while it might have stabilized situations, and I think in some people's minds was intended to provide a route, a pathway to easing tariffs. I think there's already steps taken by some of Biden's own foreign policy team, which are already undermining that. And that's by, and I'm going to say it straightforwardly, spreading lies about what was said over the course of that summit.
As listening to you as they're going through this compulsory jabbing and lockdowns again, it seems to me that when that fails, because it will fail as well, when that plan fails, and maybe they roll out, well, it's failing because everyone has gotten the boosters. Now we've got to do the booster. And when that fails, their plan B to me seems like it's going to be some sort of conflict somewhere, most likely Ukraine. I think that's where we're going to focus. I think they're still they're nervous about going after Taiwan and China. I think
they're very
feel more
nervous.
confident in creating something in Ukraine in order to distract. So I'm looking at their plan A is lockdown, full lockdown again, and boosters and all of this stuff. And when and if all of that fails, then they're going to focus in on Russia and on Ukraine. And that's the plan B or the plan C.
The trouble is, and this is actually the paradox, at the moment, the Chinese have superiority, military superiority over Taiwan, but it's not overwhelming. In Ukraine, the Russians have overwhelming superiority. The perception is because Russia is the weaker power, and it is. I mean, Russia's a far less powerful country than China is. It has a much bigger nuclear deterrent capability. But it's only got a tenth of China's population and a far smaller economy. So the perception is that Russia is somehow weaker. But of course, weakness globally, if you like, doesn't always translate to weakness regionally. And at the moment, Taiwan, which is, a big place, and it's an island, is in the sea. The United States still has by far the world's most powerful navy. China would probably win a conflict over Taiwan, but it would be a tough thing. Actually, Ukraine is different. It would not be quite as tough a thing as it would be for China to win in Taiwan. But, the neocons, the strange thing about the neocons is that though they talk in this extraordinarily belligerent way, and they're always looking for conflicts everywhere, they have an extraordinary inability to weigh risks objectively, to actually look at facts on the ground, to say to themselves, well, if there's a conflict in Ukraine, it might even be a bigger debacle for us at this moment in time than it would be if there was a conflict over Taiwan. Because, in fact, the Russians are militarily stronger there than the Chinese are actually relative to Taiwan. And that kind of miscalculation is there. Now, this has been a rolling story about Ukraine. And we've now, I think, reached that point of clarity with it. And I've been trying to work out for some time what that visit of Burns, CIA Director Burns to Moscow, was all about. And I think it's now become absolutely clear that the Americans, the administration, and the French and the Germans were trying to basically trick the Russians into direct negotiations with the Ukrainians, and that this has made the whole diplomatic agenda over the summer. And the Russians repeatedly said no. And the latest trick was to try to set up a Normandy 4 summit, a meeting of all the sort of Europeans and the Russians and the Ukrainians, try to arrange it into some kind of a bilateral summit meeting between Putin and Zelensky. And again, the Russians said no. And when the Russians said no, the Europeans said, well, actually, it's just Lavrov saying no. Maybe Putin, we can win Putin round. And there were all sorts of stories circulating that Lavrov had wrecked a diplomatic initiative to settle the crisis, which Putin had green-lighted. And of course, the Russians are absolutely livid about this. And they've now said that there are not going to be any further negotiations with the Europeans or the Americans about Ukraine whatsoever until the Ukrainians come round and do what they are required to do under the Minsk agreement. So in effect, negotiations have completely broken down. This is something which I think people don't realize. And I think that was what caused Burns to rush to Moscow to see if something could be retrieved from this situation. The trouble is, where there are no negotiations and the situation is unsustainable, you will get the war drums beating before very long. And they already are. We got all this talk about this Russian military buildup, which nobody could see, by the way. This is the invisible army on Ukraine's borders, but, they still talk about it. And it's highly possible in this kind of situation that where you have a diplomatic deadlock, some kind of resort to war follows. And the neocons seem to be pushing for it. They seem to be agitating for it. There's a bizarre article, by the way, in The Atlantic by Anne Applebaum, who's one of the sort of most prominent neocons, who talks in this way. And John Bolton has now suddenly reappeared, resurfaced, and you sort of do worry when people like that sort of reemerge, and one senses that they see their opportunity to start a war, and it does look as if Ukraine is the place they're going to go for.
Yeah, Ukraine, they hold Ukraine in their back pocket.
Yeah.
Whenever their first plan doesn't go as they want, they just throw Ukraine there in war with Russia. But they always hold it hostage, and they keep it in their back pocket just in case things don't go as planned. Why are we going to look towards the US to save us from all of this, Alexander? Because obviously the EU, we know where they're heading in lockstep, even though we have two outliers, which is Serbia, and Serbia is starting to move towards that direction, but not full. And we have an important vote in Switzerland as far as mandates and passports and all that stuff. But, the EU, we know where they're heading. China, you mentioned China, Asia, Russia is heading in that direction as well. The US is going to be a hard one to get to the lockdown passport stage of things. And I think a war with Ukraine may also help to distract Americans as well from resisting those sorts of lockdowns and stuff. But the US is going to be hard. It's going to be hard because Biden's incompetent. There's a power vacuum. Kamala Harris is more incompetent, if that's even possible. They're fighting between each other. There's literally a civil war in the White House as we speak. And the country's just in complete disarray from what is supposed to be its leadership. So we got to look at the US to save us from all of this. That's my belief. And it has the Constitution, it has the Bill of Rights, it has the framework to resist.
It does have all those things, and that's the fundamental difference. So, and it's a big country, and it's in some ways still a very self-confident country, and people are prepared to come out and vote. And as I said, the polls, the opinion polls, the polling now points clearly to a Republican blowout in the midterms next year, and that's before long going to start shaping the political mood. By the way, there's going to be a growing feeling in the US that with the Republicans coming back hard, that's going to start changing the way in which politics are conducted in the US and how policy is conducted in the US. And on top of that, because of the Constitution, because of the framework of laws that exist there, which are embedded in US society and in the US legal system, there are opportunities for legal challenges. And we are increasingly seeing that. We saw that with the recent decision of the Court of Appeals of the 5th District, which threw out, or at least has not thrown out, it's actually frozen a decision of the president, with mandates, because, they say this raises enormous constitutional issues. And we're probably going to see more of that. And it could lead up to a major political swing around perhaps the second part of next year. Also, on top of all of this, bear in mind, and I don't think this should be underestimated, it's a wild card. We don't know how this is going to play out, and it may not play out at all. I mean, be prepared to be disappointed. But the Durham investigation now seems to be coming to life in a very menacing way, and that could also start to affect the political weather. It's been fascinating to read some very weird articles that are starting to appear in parts of the media, the mainstream media, which ran with Russiagate. And it's becoming increasingly clear to me that, one, they're trying to distance themselves from Russiagate, but they're also scared. And that there is that to play. That's a wild card. We don't know how that's going to work out. But the problem is, even though the domestic part of US policy is starting to shift, the geopolitical foreign policy part remains as bad as always. And indeed, potentially it's getting worse, because what you actually see is that with Trump no longer directly in charge, the neocon tendency of the Republican Party has reasserted itself with a vengeance. And there is now a bidding war in Congress about which of the two parties can be tougher. First on Russia, they're now proposing to delegitimize the next Russian presidential election. I mean, a zany thing, which the Russians, by the way, are milking for all it's worth. But anyway, that's another story. But I mean, more sanctions, for example, on Nord Stream 2, all of that sort of thing. And one senses it's the same with China and everywhere. So, take as hard a line as possible, not so much because you're really focused on Russia or China or because you're thinking of these geopolitical things, but because you're both on a sort of neocon treadmill and you're racing each other as to who is going to prove tougher. Now, I don't think this is actually what the American people want at all. In fact, every single poll and survey that I've seen shows that the American people want, more than anything else, peace. They want to see an end to this international and global tension. But the political class in the United States seems to be still caught up in this. So we will see what's going to come. But 2022 will be an interesting year in the United States. It could be a breakthrough year in the United States, but it could also be a breakdown year in the United States. And the foreign policy is far from looking good at the moment.
I agree. It's either going to be a year where we do get a breakthrough and we're saved, for lack of a better word, from all of this madness. I don't know by whom or from where. I don't know. But like I said, I think it's going to come from the U.S. and maybe it'll come from the midterms. I don't know, but the midterms are a year away. So they're coming up. It's close, but it's also far. So, it's hard to say. Or it could be a complete breakdown. I agree with that sentiment. And when I mean a breakdown, Alexander, I mean like, you have lockdowns in Europe. They don't work in the U.S., but Biden continues to deteriorate. Kamala just can't stop messing up. And the lockdown situation, the jab situation in the U.S. does not come through the way they wanted to go through. So the neocons, the Republicans, the Democrats, all of them decide, you know what, let's just go for broke and start a war in Ukraine. And that would lead to the breakdown because NATO, the U.S., they would get their asses handed to them in a big, big way. It would be the embarrassment of a lifetime. I really do believe that. It would be a 4-day war where Russia just rolls over the country and rolls over NATO, and Europe would get the brunt of the damage. The EU would just go to freaking hell because you'll combine lockdowns with a war. It would be just catastrophic.
Absolutely.
That's the picture that I see for it. But it could all go well as well. It could get a midterm win and things could go well. So
could start to stabilize. I mean, it's going to be in geopolitical terms, a lot depends on what happens this winter. And this winter is a particularly dangerous moment because, as I said, if the crisis deepens in winter, and there's this festering political crisis, which is a leadership crisis in the United States, which we need to come to in a moment, by the way. But a war in Ukraine in this winter, is a distinct possibility. By the way, I agree entirely with your analysis of what would happen if there was such a war. I mean, I would
elaborate on it because you know it better than I do, and you always say it better than I do. So elaborate on it.
Well, first of all, I mean, the Russian military operates on a completely different level of technological and sophistication than the Ukrainian military does. Now, giving it odd bits and bobs of, javelin anti-tank missiles and all that sort of thing, that doesn't change things because, of course, it's not just. What a thing people never understand is that giving a weak military some advanced weapons doesn't really help them, because in order to operate weapons properly, each weapons all complement each other, and you need a sort of technological skills in depth right across a military in order to make them function effectively. And of course, the Russians have that. The Ukrainians manifestly don't. But on top of all of this, the Ukrainian military itself is it has none of the organization or structure or discipline or training or leadership that the Russian military does. I mean, Russian military formations operate on a completely different scale, and the Russians can move forces through Ukraine or to Ukraine with a speed that no one can see. Bear in mind also, Russia has an air force, which is again vastly more sophisticated than that which Ukraine does. Russian pilots have all now had training in actual battlefield conditions in places like Syria. I mean, it would be a smash. It would be over within, I don't know, 4 days, but it would be over within weeks. Bear in mind, back in 2008, when there was the war between Georgia and Russia, the Georgians were heavily equipped with lots of Western weapons, and Russian military in those days was still very much in its early stages of reorganization. And the Russians only had about the same number of troops on the ground that the Georgians did. Obviously, the Russian military overall was much bigger, but the number of ground forces was about 10,000 men on each side. And Saakashvili, who was the Georgian president, assumed that because the Georgians were close there, that would give him an advantage. And in fact, the Georgian military was defeated and effectively destroyed within 3 days. So I'm not saying it'd be 3 days or 4 days with Ukraine because it's a much bigger country, but it would be very quick. It would be over very fast.
It would be whatever Russia wanted it to be, depending
Absolutely.
on how far in Russia wanted to go.
Exactly.
Do they go to Kiev? Do they just go and stop at Odessa and just completely cut off the country from any from the sea? Yeah, from the Black Sea. Do they do that? It depends on what they want to do. Saakashvili, who is now on hunger strike, he's been on hunger strike for a month, and he just yesterday he called for the U.S. to intervene and to save him from his imprisonment in Georgia. Why he went back to Georgia? What was he thinking? I don't know exactly what's going on in his head. I'm starting to think he's actually he's a smart man, clever man, but he's also mentally disturbed as well because he had no reason to go back there.
Many people have said that, by the way. It's not the first time. There's been a lot of people who say that Saakashvili has, shall we say, a tenuous grasp of reality. It's a very weird decision to make. And when I say people, when I say many people, I mean, people who work with him in Ukraine, who are viscerally anti-Russian themselves. They found Saakashvili an impossible person to work with because they found him so unstable. So, I mean, I'm not going to try and enter his head or work out his reasoning. It could have been that the Georgian government, which wanted him back and wanted him in prison, I know that this has been suggested, that they've infiltrated his entourage and that they got some of those people in his entourage to tell him that, if he returned to Georgia, there'd be huge uprising and he'd be greeted as the conquering hero. And of course, the moment he arrived at the airport, he was immediately arrested. By the way, that's exactly what some of Navalny's associates are now saying, that Navalny's equally strange decision to go back to Russia was actually planted in his head by Russian intelligence agents who'd infiltrated his entourage. So it might be that we've seen something like that actually happening. Who knows? I mean, I don't know. I have no way of knowing one way or the other. But these are two unusual people, Navalny and Saakashvili. And as I said, I'm not going to try and enter their heads and try to second guess what they're thinking.
Very interesting. You play on their narcissism.
Yeah, absolutely.
And very interesting tactic. Yeah, it makes sense.
It makes sense. It makes a great deal of sense. In both cases, it would be the logical explanation. And of course, if the Russians did that with Navalny, and there's been some suggestions that the present Georgian government has some kind of quiet connection to the Russians. Well, who knows? Maybe the Russians gave the Georgians some advice about how to do it with Saakashvili. Not the Georgian government is friendly to Russia, but they both hate Saakashvili. Yeah. So that might have been what the whole thing was all about.
Two more topics I want to discuss with you, Alexander, before we do some super chats and knock those out. We have a lot of great questions, both in the chat in locals, which I want to get to as well, and super chats that are waiting as well. Really good questions for us to dig into. But the first question is, what do you make of Putin giving the, I forgot what medal it was, the friendship medal to the Hungarian foreign minister?
Well, I mean, it was a clear
interesting move.
It was an interesting move, but it was also a way to point out to Hungary, first of all, to reward Hungary for being independent, but also a way of telling the Hungarians, Orban, telling also the Europeans that if there's a major showdown with Hungary, between the EU and Hungary, Hungary has Russia's back. Russia's at its back. So I think that was partly what that was intended to do.
And with Russia comes China, I imagine.
And with Russia comes China. Same, by the way, with the Balkans. The situation in the Balkans is now getting tense. There's major issues in Bosnia. The British are getting very worked up about the fact that
what about the Albania story? Yeah,
all of this exactly.
Albania is going to process the English Channel refugees that are looking to enter the UK from the Channel. Bosnia is going to have a processing center.
Well, I know, except
Albania is going to have a processing center.
Yes, except of course, Albania has completely and categorically denied it, and apparently they're very, very angry about it. But I mean, there are very odd things going on. There are very strange things going on, and of course, at the same time as all this is happening, Serbia is now negotiating for long-term gas contracts with Moscow, and it's going to get them. And they've also just received a further supply of T-72 tanks from Russia, which is, of course, again, another way of Russia saying, if you get into trouble, if there's a war, we're there, we will support you. It won't be 1999 all over again. So it's the Russians making these geopolitical counter moves, and you can absolutely say the Russians have saying we got Serbia. If Serbia and Hungary get into trouble, we're there to support them, and of course the Russians know that they've got the Chinese behind them too. Putin made a very interesting comment. There was a big meeting at the Russian Foreign Ministry just yesterday, in which he said that the US is trying to create problems between Russia and China, and this will never succeed. And this is all over the Chinese media today, and they've been hailing these comments and basically talking up again their strategic partnership with Russia. So this geopolitical combination is increasingly making the weather internationally. Doesn't mean these two countries don't have their problems. China, as we know, has had energy problems. It's affected by the inflation. It's also struggling with pandemic-related issues. Russia, ditto. They haven't had energy shortages, and they're not going to get energy shortages, but they've got very bad inflation at the moment, which, as I said, they feel very bitter about. And of course, they are also doing the same thing with the pandemic issues that everybody else is.
So we have Hungary and Serbia is about to ink deals for natural gas and energy with Russia. Anyone else? Any other countries in Europe that have deals?
Moldova. And this is a surprise, because this is a pro-Western government that came to power with enormous amount of help from the European Union. They wanted to knock out Igor Dodon, who was the pro-Russian Moldovan president. They managed to do it by mobilizing votes from the Moldovan diaspora in Europe to try to vote him out, and they succeeded, and they got a strongly pro-Western government in charge in Moldova. And of course, it quickly discovered that it cancelled the long-term gas contracts with Gazprom that Moldova had, and the idea was that they'd do what Ukraine does and buy gas on the European spot markets and all that sort of thing. And then Moldova, even the new pro-Western government very quickly realized that is economically impossible. It would lead Moldova into crisis. They're nervous about their support within Moldova itself because they depended so much on the votes of diaspora Moldovans, people who don't actually live in Moldova, for their electoral victory. They didn't want to see energy blackouts in Moldova this winter. They were apparently afraid that that would lead to unrest. So they patched up a long-term deal with Gazprom against European Union advice.
Yeah. Terrible inflation everywhere.
Everywhere.
War is coming. I don't know. That's
well,
my
indeed.
conclusion to that. Inflation everywhere. War is
absolutely,
coming.
Absolutely. And an aspect which isn't widely noticed is that Xi Jinping actually told Biden to his face, your economic policies are creating worldwide problems. And of course, he was referring to the inflation, and that, in future, you've got to have sound economic management, because if you don't, that affects you, but it also affects everyone. I don't think that the president of the United States, we must still call him that, was paying much attention. And certainly I don't think his aides were. And at the center of it all, by the way, and just to finish, there is this festering political crisis at the center of power in the United States itself, a president who's visibly not in control, and a vice president who is completely lacks both ability and competence, and who has lost the confidence of the American political class. So what do you do?
Did you see the interview with Stephanopoulos and Kamala Harris, where he asked her, do you feel, I'm paraphrasing, I think he asked her, do you feel properly utilized or left out or something along those lines? I was just sitting there going, this is incredible. Stephanopoulos, of course, is very close to the Clintons. I mean, he is part of the Clinton machine. Yeah. And he is asking Kamala Harris, who is part of the Obama machine, in my opinion. That's how I see it. Do you feel left out? Do you feel like you're not being utilized by the White House? It was incredible.
Well, it's what we call in Britain the "Are you beating your wife?" question. I mean, it's the sort of question which, in itself, you can't really answer it, because what is Kamala going to say? She says, "Oh no, of course, I don't feel left out at all. I'm fully supported." Even if she answers it in that way, the very fact that the question is being posed in itself provides the real answer. It communicates right around the United States and within the political class that there are doubts about Kamala's position in the administration. So bear in mind, we started with the Biden-Harris administration. There was that very strange period of the first few weeks after the inauguration, when Kamala was meeting foreign heads of state, conducting what looked like a parallel foreign policy to the Biden teams. And now, very rapidly, as it's become obvious that she's not up to that, they're trying to straightforwardly say, trying to find ways to remove her, because I can't really see how it can end any other way than that.
Yeah. Before I get to super chats, Alexander, and questions, is the Biden White House going to boycott the Olympics?
Well, that's another thing. That's another thing. So you have a meeting with Xi Jinping. You agitate and press for this meeting for the better part of a year. A meeting comes along. I mean, it doesn't result in any breakthroughs, but you do at least have a civilized conversation with him. And it's a very interesting conversation indeed. And I've discussed it in a humongously long video I had to do with my program, because the Chinese readouts are very long. But anyway, you have this civil meeting. What do you do? What do you do directly after you have this meeting with the Chinese leader? You start talking about a diplomatic boycott of the Winter Olympics in China. I mean, exactly the sort of thing which is going to annoy the Chinese more than anything else. I mean, bear in mind, and I don't want to overplace this, but it is a case that in Asia, questions of faith are taken seriously. So this is going to be seen as deeply offensive in China, just after their president met the US president. And that comes on top of Jake Sullivan and his team busy spinning in the media a story about a Chinese concession at the summit, which never took place, a supposed pledge by Xi Jinping to start arms control talks, something which never happened. It's juvenile. It's not thought through. If you constantly play to the gallery in the United States in this way, you cannot conduct a foreign policy, because foreign policy isn't conducted in this fashion. And once upon a time, when the United States was a country led by serious people, and I can remember those days, that never happened.
Yeah. God, can you imagine if they boycott the games? Well, not that the Olympics is important anymore, it seems, but still. It's the message that it sends out.
Well, the trouble is, if there's a diplomatic boycott, then of course the usual suspects will start demanding a full boycott, and that will not go down well in Beijing.
Yeah, and if the U.S. boycotts, then you're going to have pretty much all of the Five Eyes and Western Europe.
Absolutely,
will
they will follow, and that will make China very angry. It won't just make China very angry; it will make many millions, hundreds of millions of Chinese very angry too. They will see it as an insult to their country. It's the sort of thing that in Asia goes down very badly indeed. It's not like Russia. Here, Russia is different. I mean, the Russians absorb these sorts of punches because they've learned to, but the Chinese are much more touchy about them.
Have you heard about the Chinese tennis player, the women's tennis player that's missing?
No,
have you heard that story?
No, I haven't.
We should take a look. It's a really strange story. Supposedly, she said that one of the upper level Chinese politicians, like a vice premier or something like that, sexually assaulted her or something along those lines, and she put that on WeChat. I believe WeChat, Weibo is Weibo the network? Yeah, that's their Twitter. Yeah, and she put that on that social network, and she's been missing like ever since. And the Women's Tennis Association is now saying they're going to pull out of China if she doesn't reappear.
Oh my goodness!
It's a very bizarre, very interesting story. But
it is a very interesting story.
I'll send you some links.
That would be very interesting indeed.
Yeah, I don't know what to make of it. Anyway, let's do some. Let's get some questions going. So we have a lot of good questions in the queue here. We have from Amrit, which says, in April, Italian semicon making machine firm called IPE got Chinese interests, but Draghi got vetoed the sale. Good for your own firm. Do what you want. Do what you want. Part one, Draghi. Isn't it interesting that you have Draghi running Italy and he wasn't elected, and now you have? Can you make the statement that Schallenberg in Austria? I mean, he's not elected.
Well, of course he's not elected. I mean,
he's running Austria now.
He's running Austria.
The EU is turning into, it's just turning into, just appointed
absolutely
officials.
But that's exactly what the logic of the situation is. You have the Central Committee, if you like, in Brussels, which appoints the first secretaries. I mean, that's how it worked in Moscow in Soviet times. And essentially, you're reproducing that model all across Europe, and that's logical because, as I said, remember that at the center of power, the core institution of the European Union, the Commission, is unelected.
Yeah, and they're just appointing officials now. It's becoming very common.
Absolutely, as I said, what I said. I mean, you have obviously. I mean, in the Soviet Union, you had all kinds of theoretical elections, but nobody, of course, took those very seriously. As I said, the Central Committee appoints the regional party first secretaries. This is the model we now see.
And then they lecture other countries about democracy as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's the funny part about it when you have Ursula von der Leyen talking about democracy.
Absolutely.
Like, okay, Ursula. Have you ever run for anything in your life? I mean, it's completely bizarre.
Not successfully.
Not successfully. All right. Rich says 2 defense firms, Otto Melara, naval gun world leader, and WASS, world leader in torpedoes, is getting French-German interests. So Draghi wants to sell them to those critical firms. Italy protests, and it's called fascist. Part 2.
Well, indeed, absolutely. Now, can I just say, I mean, I hadn't heard of the torpedo company, though I'm sure it's incredibly advanced torpedoes and all that. But Otto Melara is one of the iconic gun and cannon producers, and it's very much identified with Italy. And of course, if it is sold to foreign buyers, then that will certainly have an effect in Italy as well. But there you go. There was a former British Prime Minister Harold Macmillan who once talked about selling the family silver. There seems to be a case in that.
Yeah. Valley S, thank you for your super chat, your $20 super chat. Thank you very much, Valley S. Really appreciate it. And Cosmic Rain super chat says, "Hey lads, hope you are both well. Just a short message and donation to show my support for the Duran. As always, keep up the great work." Thank you.
Thank you very much,
Cosmic Rain. We appreciate it. And Rich says, "None of these firms belong to Draghi. They are Italy's. Italy should punish these people severely. French, German, or Italian officials unleash Italian fury." They're not going to punish anybody, especially Draghi.
In the West today, you never get punished for doing those sort of things. You never get punished for selling off. You get promoted, exactly. I mean, the globalist networks will look after you, and they will see that you go up. And of course, if you are prosecuted, if any situation, I don't know what the legal position would be, but let's assume there was some violation of some law and a prosecution was brought, you get all the usual people saying this is a violation of human rights, a politically motivated prosecution, and all those sort of things. If you prosecute Salvini for protecting Italy's borders, well, that's one thing. But if you take action against Draghi for selling Otto Melara to France and Germany, well, that's politically motivated prosecution. That is the reality of today's world.
Yeah. Simon says here, NATO fights Russia, China stabs Russia in the back, seizing Serbia, China then energy resource independent, nullifying any U.S. blockade, China becomes the global hegemon. Hunter buys a super yacht.
Well, I mean, yeah, Simon is being, witty, as he often is. But of course, he's making a point. I mean, none of this in geopolitical or world power terms makes any sense. Now, I get it. Every so often, we get people who say to us that we're not being tough enough on China, or as tough on China as we should, and China has become this giant power. Who made it that giant power? Certainly the Chinese themselves did a lot, but they got lots of helping hands from the United States, both because the United States wanted to use them initially against the Soviets, but then because the US constantly goes up against Russia in a way that works always in the end in China's interests. And this is so obvious. It's so obviously clear that it is very strange that there is still this enormous resistance to accepting it. It shows how viscerally strong hostility to Russia is in the West.
Yeah. Here's a great question from Peter. Could Montenegro ever leave NATO? What do you make of the EU's future with the Balkans?
Well, in theory, it could, and it's entirely possible. And bear in mind, it's a very divided society, and many, many people in Montenegro feel a strong attachment to Serbia and feel very, very angry about the way in which their country was detached from Serbia, and very critical and hostile to the previous Montenegrin government. In theory, it is entirely possible. In practice, I suspect that NATO would pull every lever, and I'm not just talking about persuasion, I'm talking about every other kind of thing to keep Montenegro within NATO. The idea that any country can leave NATO is not something that NATO wants to contemplate at all. Perhaps if it's Turkey, led by someone like Erdogan, you could conceivably expel it, but you would certainly not want a country to leave NATO voluntarily.
Yeah. James from Locals says, can you guys do a geopolitical overview of the Chalos gas fields? The Iranian, the Caspian Sea.
Absolutely. And this is a huge this is a massive topic because bear in mind, way back in the early 2000s, the European Union was building a pipeline supposedly to Azerbaijan, or was talking of building a gas pipeline supposedly to Azerbaijan. It was called the Nabucco pipeline, after the title of one of Verdi's operas, by the way. And the idea was that it would send gas from Azerbaijan bypassing Russia, and this would end the EU's dependence on Russia. Now, the problem was there was never anywhere near enough gas in Azerbaijan to make that difference. And everybody knew, it was an open secret. I knew people who were telling me this at the time, that in fact the real purpose was to tap those gas fields in Iran. And that was the idea. That was the grand plan. Except it didn't work out because, of course, relations between the United States and Europe on the one hand and Iran deteriorated. And the expectation in 2009 that the Iranian government would fall. You remember there were all those big protests in Iran in 2009 after the disputed election, which Ahmadinejad won. There were widespread expectations at the time that the Iranian government, the Iranian system was either going to change or fall, or there would be a Western leader take over. All of that was dashed. So that didn't play out at all as expected. But, these people never give up. I'm sure there's some people who still harbor those desires or expectations or hopes that could very easily be revived. The difference between now and 2009 is that today you have a rival who wants Iran's gas and is prepared to pay for it, perhaps even outbid the European Union for all that gas, and that's China. So where in 2009 and before, it was an attractive option for some Iranians to sell the gas to Europe, today it's much less so.
Yeah. Dan Noyes' super chat says Klaus Schwab's school graduates, Ardern, Merkel, Macron, Kurz, Orban, Juncker, Baerbock, Newsom, Buttigieg, Gates, Bezos, Branson, Chelsea Clinton, all fascists, were still fighting World War II. Tell me I'm crazy.
No, you're not crazy. That's all I'm going to say about that, because you're absolutely not crazy.
Interesting alumni from the Klaus Schwab school. That's for sure.
Well, let's put it like this. I don't know about Chelsea, but I mean, all the others certainly go to
Chelsea. Chelsea's the outlier. What's she doing on that list?
I didn't.
She's a legacy because of her parents.
Exactly. I mean, I don't know much about Chelsea, actually, so I'm not going to comment on her. But I mean, all the others certainly go to Davos on a fairly regular basis. So, absolutely, yeah.
Yep. There was a question in the locals chat about the inflation in Sweden, but I lost that one. So anyway, the inflation in Sweden was also skyrocketing as well, or has been skyrocketing for a while.
It is everywhere. And can I just make a point here? Because what we get different inflation numbers in most countries. So in the United States, inflation is now supposedly running at 6.2%, which is historically enormously high.
Do you believe that?
No, I do not believe it. I do not believe it. I think it's much higher than that. I suspect it's double-digit inflation. Now, it's important to understand. I mean, there are all sorts of reasons why I believe that. And, you have someone like John Williams at Shadow Stats who goes even further on that than I am prepared to do. Not because I think he's necessarily wrong, but because I can't, go over his figures. I don't have the time to. But I think it's much higher than 6.2. I think it's double digits. But always understand this. When you get economic growth readings, GDP growth, GDP is a figure that's put together by adding together, the value of goods and services produced. If you are underestimating the rate of inflation, then what you're going to do is you're going to overstate your growth figures, because part of what you are actually calling growth is simply a rise in prices. And in the United States, I suspect that's already happening, actually.
Yeah. On inflation, this super chat from Joanna says, are interest rates being inflated worldwide to crash the economy and then to pave way for the one world currency under the NWO?
Well, I don't know
being
about,
done on purpose. Yeah.
Well, I mean, this is the question that one constantly gets asked. I mean, all I would say, and I said this many times, if it is being done on purpose, and there are certainly some people who I can well believe would want to do a thing like that on purpose, but I'm not saying it is like that, because how can we ultimately say for sure at this moment in time? But if it is being done on purpose, the people who are doing it are not clever, they are stupid. Because if there is a major breakdown in the world economic system, they will not surf the wave, as they perhaps assume. They will drown. They will be the first to drown, because most people will find some way of getting by. But these people will first be blamed, and that will be very difficult for them. And secondly, they will find that they've unleashed forces that are ultimately going to be directed at themselves. You do not destabilize your own society on purpose. Every political class that does that goes down. It fails. The French aristocracy did that on the eve of the revolution, where they were trying to create problems for the king, because they wanted the king to share power with them, and they created a sense of crisis in France in the 1780s. And they were, of course, they got a revolution in which they were swept away. And on Locals, we're doing a whole series of programs in which we're setting up the scene for the eventual crisis that happened in Russia in 1917. And we've discussed there the strategy of tension. We're discussing there the strategy of tension that existed in Russia through some elements of the political system. The liberals, the oligarchs that existed in Russia then, they too wanted to destabilize the system, because they thought that this would bring them into bring the whole system under their control. And in fact, they were swept away.
Yeah, we got a new episode of that going live tomorrow, so keep an eye out for that tomorrow. But can you explain that a little bit more, Alexander? Because the common thinking is, my thinking on this is the way I always looked at it, is the reverse of what you said. My thinking was that the powers that be, say the Davos crowd, they want the inflation. They want to tear everything apart, because the thinking is they are the ones that can weather those storms, and it'll be the everyday common people that will suffer. And for them, they'll be able to get by. It's the other people that won't. They're going to come up and buy everything up. And
it never works like that. Let me just give one example, one very simple example. Every political elite has power because it is able to control the armed forces and the security services of, well, let's call it the state, the structure of society that functions. In a world of inflation, how does it pay them? So that's already going to be a problem. How do you pay the police? How do you pay the army to continue to be loyal to you? And if they're not loyal to you, if they're not being paid, why should they be loyal to you? They will simply melt away. That's what happened in France. That's what happened in Russia. You get a demoralized system, and you find it. And that's just one example of many things that I mean. Whatever one may think, this is a society. We live in a society, an economic system, where relationships are both societal and transactional. If both break down, those who stand at the apex of society will fall. They will fall fastest and furthest, because they exist at the top of a pyramid of economic, social, societal, and legal obligations and responsibilities, which in a crash will all break down. So people at the bottom, somebody will survive, somebody will come through, but you never find the people at the apex survive. Same thing happened to Rome. All those senators, all those senatorial families, what became of them when the empire fell? And can I just say something? I saw an interesting program recently on YouTube. Well, interesting enough, a historian was actually saying one of the great mysteries in European history is what became of the senatorial aristocracy of Rome. Why did they all vanish so completely when the empire fell? Why do they have no descendants today?
Well, what became of them?
Yeah. Well, what became of them? We don't know. But the fact is, they were bound up with a structure, the social, economic, political structure, and though they were constantly, this is another good example, they were constantly aggrandizing themselves at the expense of the emperor. At the end of the Roman Empire, the wealth of the senatorial families was probably greater relative to the rest of humanity than we have seen at any point in history until today. I mean, that's today we've actually exceeded that. The concentration of wealth is even greater than it was in late imperial Rome. But when the whole system, the whole imperial system collapsed, they disappeared, they vanished. And to this day, we simply do not know what became of them.
Yeah. Sparky says, a borderless world run by central authority. What's not to like? By the way, thrilled to hear about Alexander's twins. There'll be a few dull moments. Thank you, Sparky. A centralized authority. Yeah, what's not to like?
Well, that's the idea. That's the great plan. I mean, you run everything in a completely technocratic way. You have presumably a single central bank. Everything's done digitally. Everything's controlled. And as I said, it's utopian. It's not just utopian; it's actually mad. Can I just say? I mean, it is straightforwardly an insane view of human society, and it will fail. The problem is, we can talk about the collapse of the people who would be running it, but of course, everybody else would pay an enormous price for it.
Yeah. G. Getcham found the message on Sweden. Thank you very much for that. It said, in southern Sweden, this is from Tsunami Bomb. In southern Sweden, electricity prices are 10 times higher than 20 years ago. It is getting worse because of cables to the continent and now to GB, and I have to pay for it 10 times higher.
Well, absolutely. Well, that I'm sure, by the way, that's true in terms of energy. I wouldn't be surprised if that was true in terms of not just energy costs, but of many costs in Britain also. And I mean, I'm talking about Britain because obviously this is where I live. People have pretended that over the last 30 years, we've been living in a low inflation environment. Well, retail price inflation in Britain of around 2% would be considered high inflation by historical levels. So bear that in mind. Now, and that's, of course, retail price inflation. And those figures, well, first of all, we don't even know how accurate they are. And they obscure all sorts of complicated things that might be happening beneath them. Some prices might be rising much faster than that. Other prices might even be falling. But, that's one thing to say. But, of course, on top of that, we're now getting inflation today, which is adding a huge problem on top of that, too.
Yeah. And Dav Will says, Alexander, it always fails. He's confirming your analysis, Alexander. So that's good. You have a confirmation to your analysis. And we have from Larry Darrell in Locals who says, the magic juice, a loyalty test. A kakistocracy is a government run by the worst, least qualified, or most unscrupulous citizens. The word was coined as early as the 17th century.
Indeed, and not so very different from what we have now. I mean, bear in mind, these people are bad, corrupt, as I said, profoundly stupid.
Greek word, kakistocracy.
Oh, absolutely. But absolutely, quite so. It by the way, to those who speak Greek, it has a somewhat even cruder sound, but I'm not going to say what it is.
Greek speakers in the in the live chat don't know what we're talking about.
Exactly.
Yeah, very, very well said. Interesting comment from Boris Negrarosa says post-Soviet era is a tale of global impoverishment.
You know, you're so right, and it's so sad because I remember, when the Soviet Union fell, and there was all these expectations that everything around the world was coming right all at the same time, and there's a period of enormous optimism, and the way in which all of those hopes were dashed, they were not fulfilled. Things went in reverse in so many ways. It is really tragic. The problem was, what happened when the Soviet Union fell is that certain people saw this as an opportunity to actually set up something which, amazingly enough, is not so different from the Soviet Union, at least their conception of the Soviet Union. And so this model reproduced itself in a very weird and corrupt way.
Yeah. They made a worse version, it seems.
Yeah, much worse version.
Yeah. Brian wants to know, any thoughts on the Scots government, speaking of not developing the Cambo field off Shetland?
Yeah, I'm not up to date with this. I mean, I know about this story, and of course it's coming for some sort of criticism. I mean, there might be environmental issues. There might be, and this is not something to be discounted. Scotland, for those of people who've been there, is an incredibly beautiful country, and there might be some pushback if it disfigures the landscape in some ways. I mean, I don't know. I'm not going to speculate about this, but the fact remains that the overarching story is that the Scottish government is as fervently opposed to fossil fuels as all other governments in Europe and indeed in the developed world are. And of course, this is particularly paradoxical, given that Scotland's economy has been based for the last 50 years largely on fossil fuels, North Sea oil and all that. And also that there doesn't really seem to be a way forward. No real alternatives are being offered. There's this idea that you can replace everything with windmills and solar power stations. Well, solar power might work in a place like northern Scotland in the summer, where they have very long days. I can't really see it working in winter there when they have very long nights. So, I mean, there's all sorts of problems with solar power. Windmill power, well, we've seen how erratic that is. And, these things are just not thought through. And they're not thought through by green lobbies, which have, I find astonishing, by the way, how disproportionately strong their influence on governments has become over the last 30 years. 40 years. How that came about, I'm really not so sure. I say that, people will probably figure out that I have certain views on certain issues, which are, skeptical, but I don't want to discuss those because our friends keep a very close eye on everything that we discuss about that.
Actually, going off what you said, Tucker Carlson on his show last night tried to answer the very question you just posed, which is that the Green lobby, which has disproportionate power, he made the claim that it was because it plays into the hands of the Wall Street guys, i.e. the financial sector, which doesn't really produce anything, and the tech oligarchs. I think the move from energy oligarchs to tech oligarchs, and it plays into their hands because they don't have to, in their minds at least, they don't have to worry about the energy sector in their minds.
I think that is profoundly true. I think it's also managed to an extraordinary degree of success to win over young people who, of course, bring a particular dynamism to any particular movement, because it's managed to package itself as somehow an anti-establishment thing, even though Green parties everywhere are now the most neoliberal and extreme parts, if you like, of the establishment. But that's I should watch him. I mean,
that's what he said. Honest, yeah, it's just interesting because that's what he said.
To be honest, I mean, this is one of the things. I mean, I follow a lot of news, as people realize, but I can't follow everything, especially with the demands that are being made upon me at the moment, which I told will be continuing for about a couple of more weeks. But anyway, I don't watch Tucker as much as I once did and would like to do.
Yeah. So yeah, he was talking about the very thing you were just talking about. Anyway, Leafy Bug says there are plenty of huge gas deposits in the world, but developing these fields is colossally expensive. Australia exports vast quantities of LNG to Asia under 25 to 30-year contracts and charges a 20% premium on its gas relative to less reliable suppliers. And customers pay the premium as reliable supply is that important. Anyone with a cursory knowledge of this market knows this. How could European planners have made such an elementary blunder? The last sentence is, of course, the most hard-hitting right there. How could they have made such a blunder?
Well, because they're stupid. Two, because they don't listen to experts. Three, because they're viscerally anti-Russian, and that's what it all really comes down to. And they can't bear the idea, basically, of buying natural gas from Russia. And of course, the whole ideology recoils against it. So they don't want to be tied down into long-term contracts, which, as the Australians have shown, and as the Russians have said, is the only way to run this industry properly and to secure energy security. But that's not what the Eurocrats want to do. So, I mean, but stupidity plays a very big role in all of this, because can I just say, even if you are viscerally anti someone, most people will act on will make a rational choice when they have to choose. But when Boris Johnson can come forward and actually say, we've got to make a decision, do we choose Ukraine and choose cheap Russian gas, and imply that we should choose to support Ukraine, well, that tells you how ideological and imbecilic the mindset has become.
Yeah, well said. Turia says the Greens are the watermelons, green on the outside, red on the inside.
Oh, absolutely.
We know how internationalist the USSR was. That's why the Schwabs try to use them. They just abandoned the worker-owned dichotomy and moved on to the human nature one. Very well said.
Absolutely, entirely true. And can I just say, a very, very good point about that they're left, but also in a way that is that alienates from what is today's left so much of what used to be their electoral base. I mean, in Britain, and it always amazes me that nobody ever says this. You endlessly get criticisms from these people about coal and how disgusting coal is. I was George Monbiot, that journalist I was talking about, is a good case in point. His language about coal is just, I mean, it's just awful. I mean, he the way he talks about it is, disgusting, loathsome material. And of course, much of the Labour parties and the Labour movements and the left's electoral base was provided in Britain historically by coal miners, and they are, of course, dominated in various coal mining communities. Now, Britain doesn't actually produce much coal anymore, but those people are still there, and they must listen to the left today, going on and on about green things, talking about the industry that had made them what they were, around which they had huge pride, with this loathing and contempt. And unsurprisingly, they're voting Conservative. If you insult them, if you offend their dignity, if you knock their traditions in that sort of fashion, well, why are you surprised if they turn against you?
Well, they don't want them. I mean, they don't want them because it's become an ideology, and they don't want them in the cult.
Absolutely. Of course they don't want them. They don't want them at all. But then...
And they don't want to be in the cult, by the way. And they don't want to be in the cult.
Of course they don't. Absolutely. And of course, well, that's the other thing. I mean, they're not those sort of people are not attracted to the kind of ideas that we have today. But of course, when you do that, then of course there are electoral consequences, which we saw in the 2019 election when all the coal mining regions voted. This is the so-called Red Wall. Went Conservatives, backed Brexit, backed the Conservatives and Johnson, and Labour lost vast tracts of its heartlands in consequence. I mean, that's the result. But then, of course, you start, when you're confronted with things like that, you start basically agitating and saying, well, are elections themselves such a good idea, and perhaps we can build a superior democracy which no longer needs them.
Yeah. Let's see here. From Mark says, what do you think of the recent behavior of Sajid Javid, British Health Secretary? The Kay Burley and Praise NHS interviews were ridiculous.
Yes, I'm not going to say anything more than that, because I mean, he's a good example, in my opinion, of a political class politician in Britain today. I mean, there's no one really outside this kind of political class that you'll find in Britain any longer. Within the political class, who's different. I mean, Corbyn was a kind of throwback to the Labour of the 1970s, but we don't like him, so we've pushed him out of the picture. And there's lots of criticisms that could be made of him also. And it was Boris Johnson is a somewhat Falstaffian figure. He's a bit eccentric and all those things, so we don't entirely like him and trust him. But if you look at the political class as a whole, it's uniform and homogeneous in Britain. It doesn't really allow for alternatives, and Javid is no different.
Yeah, there was one time like a year and a half ago, it seemed like he was doing pretty good, or like a year ago, or it seemed that he was, I don't know, I just read some stories about him that it seemed that he was pretty together. I don't know if it changed or
you've
what
always
happened.
You've always got to be careful with politicians who are part of the political system, because of course they're always manoeuvring, and I mean, especially in Britain, especially when they're Conservatives, they're always manoeuvring, and they're trying to get supporters. There's a sort of constant power struggle. British politics is continuous power struggle to an extent that's difficult to understand for outsiders. So sometimes these people will tilt, and they'll do things and say things which seem to be attractive to people and are intended to be. But of course, the moment the kaleidoscope shifts and these people have gone up and they need to appeal to another class of people, you'll see suddenly their views will change. And there's never, again, because we don't really have a media here in Britain, there's never really a person who comes along and says, well, Syed, you were saying one thing, you're saying one thing now, it's completely different from what you were saying 6 months ago, and how can you explain the discrepancy? You don't really get those interviews in Britain any longer.
Yeah, the same in the States. Yeah.
Exactly. I mean, I said this many times, if you want to see a politician who wasn't a politician, but somebody who has a real grip on people, how people really feel, you have to go outside the political class, which in Britain means going to Nigel Farage. But he's no longer in the political system. He's no longer in politics anymore. He's now, financial services, and you can see many of his videos. Media, exactly, that kind of thing. So he's not. But within the political class itself, even if you come to it with good intentions, in Britain it absorbs you.
Yeah, Sparky says cult liberals don't like those people, in quotes.
Oh, it's true enough. That's. Yeah, I'm presumably referring to coal miners. Absolutely, they don't. Same in Germany, by the way. But in Britain, it's an extreme case because, of course, the coal miners were the aristocracy of the Labour movement, and I remember how the Labour Party previously put them on a pedestal. I mean, it's not surprising that they feel betrayed, that the fact that the party, the left, everybody connected to the left has turned against them and what they stood for so comprehensively.
Yeah. Brian Berner says, "Let's go, Brandon." It's a good part to insert a "Let's go, Brandon" in there. So yeah, thank you very much, Brian, for that.
I'm now seeing increasingly people refer to President Brandon. By the way, I mean it's really, this thing is really catching on.
Oh, it's everywhere. It is everywhere.
This is one of the things about the US. I mean, Americans, not their political class any longer, but Americans in general have still retained their sense of humor, which is more than you'll find in many places.
Yeah, I agree with that. Dan Noyes has 2 super chats, but I'm going to kind of connect. They're connected, so I'll read both. A Dark Winter was a 2001 exercise to simulate a smallpox attack. Vials of smallpox have been found in the East Coast labs in the U.S. It's the new pandemic. Dan Noyes also says that Bill Gates told the U.S. to be ready for a smallpox attack. Only U.S. and Russia have samples remaining. They're going to blame Russia, and war is the last domino of the Great Reset. Bill Gates did say that, though. That is an excellent point, because there is an interview where Bill Gates was mentioning that.
I know.
Why are people? Anyway,
I know, but there's so little, there's so much, and so it's difficult to respond to that because, of course, I think that question, that super chat basically isn't a question; it's a comment, and I think it's probably right. I mean, the paradox is that the country that led the campaign against smallpox was Russia. It was the Russians back in the 50s who proposed a worldwide campaign to eradicate smallpox. Now, they did it with methods which maybe, were adopted by the world community, which perhaps one could call into question. But, to suggest that the Russians today would unleash this seems absolutely crazy. But there we go. That's what
coming from Bill Gates. Absolutely crazy. Kind of fits. Yeah,
absolutely. It kind of fits. Exactly.
Yeah. Simon's super chat is, the incompetent always hate the competent.
That is completely true.
Very true.
That is so completely true. I mean, I think both Alex and I have had personal experiences of this in our employment histories.
Yeah, very true. Where are we here? Let's see. Raul Pinto says, as a kid, I used to get my geopolitical news from Time magazine. Today, it is the Duran, 1,000,000 times better, non-aligned, and right on the money. Thank you very much, Raul, for that. And Anatoly says, who are Durham's supporters in the U.S. government?
That's a very good question. I think that Durham is a Mitch McConnell Republican enterprise. I think he was put together by William Barr, who's clearly aligned with the Mitch McConnell wing of the Republican Party. And I think that what he's doing is he's working up towards publishing some kind of report, or at least getting investigations running in the run-up to the congressional midterm elections next year. That's my assessment of it. I think that he's been let off the leash because he is damaging the Democrats, and Mitch McConnell and that wing of the party want essentially to use that to try to regain control of Congress, because that's what these people do. But whether, if I'm right in that analysis, then almost by definition, he's only going to go so far. He's not going to go all the way, because he is very much somebody who's controlled by a faction within the political class. That's my perspective on this. Now, I might be wrong. It may be that he's some kind of a maverick, who's, as some people are suggesting, who's going to go all the way by himself, and that, people are scared of him. They don't want to stop him because he's got all these files by now, which he accumulated, and that's making people nervous. I don't believe that, actually. And that's why I'm still more cautious about where this investigation is going than some people are.
Yeah, we can't forget that he was working under Barr I guess you
Absolutely.
would say that he was part of the Barr
Absolutely.
establishment, and
Well,
Bill
Barr,
Barr is obviously part of the McConnell team.
yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, Barr appointed him, Barr
Yeah.
found him, and Barr
So
appointed him. So, I mean, you know, and that's what I think this is all about.
yeah, I don't think Durham is so much about clearing Trump's name as he is about paving the way for the Republicans in 2022.
Exactly. And a potential McConnell wing Republican candidate in 2024. I mean, I think this is what it's all about. So disrupt the Democrats, embarrass them. I don't think, as I said, it will go all the way. I don't think they'll go after Barack or Hillary, for example.
No.
I don't see it going anywhere that far.
No, but they'll get people, but they won't go that
They
high.
will get people, and you know, factional fighting within the elite can be revealing. It can give us a picture of what goes on inside, how the political elite works, which can be very revealing indeed. And the indictments have been extremely interesting reading.
Yeah. Leafy Bug says it's quite remarkable how many high-profile conservative commentators are now openly advocating for the disbandment of the FBI. It seems to me that there are major tectonic shifts in the political landscape in the U.S. that could easily overwhelm the military-industrial complex, MIC.
Do you know the paradox? I think you're right, by the way. And you know, I would say something because, of course, I was, you know, brought up in the 60s and 70s. I used to watch programs like The Untouchables and all the rest. The one institution that I always, you know, hugely admired in the United States, apart from its founder, J. Edgar Hoover, who was a weird person, but putting that aside, but I always assumed and had been led to believe that the best institution in the law enforcement intelligence world in the United States was the FBI. Well, the last couple of years have been utterly disillusioning on that score. I mean, on the contrary, it seems to be a cesspit, frankly. So I think it should be disbanded, and I think it should be restructured and rebuilt as something else. I don't believe it's going to happen, though. I mean, how many things has the CIA done around the world that it's still there? So the FBI is going to continue to work in exactly the same way as always, because it will always have defenders within the political system. And ultimately, in the United States, the bias always is to preserve the institutional status quo.
Yeah, the institutions, they don't close down. They only get bigger. Yeah.
They only get bigger.
Megawit, thank you for your €5 super sticker. Says keep it up. And Raul says Ireland and Austria both over 90% jabbed and now going into full lockdown. I think the West is heading for the crappers. Any thoughts?
Well, I mean, again, I come back to what I said before. I mean, first of all, you're absolutely right, but this is
heading towards the crappers. Yeah.
Yeah. No, this is not what we were told, and this is, I mean, you know, this is the politics of it I'm talking about now. This is not what people were told at the start of this year. They were told, you know, if you go ahead, you have your thing, then it's going to end, and it's not ending, and that is causing people to feel very demoralized, and in many cases very betrayed. Now, it's not hit Britain yet to the same degree because we're still quite open. We're still open, reasonably open here, but I wonder what will happen in Britain when we do start to close down, as I predict we will. And I wonder what's going to happen in other places.
I wonder if Varadkar is going to close down Ireland, because Ireland was one of the hardest hit lockdown countries. I wonder if he's going to dare to go there.
Well, indeed, good question. Can I just say, of course, if we start locking down, then that's going to create even more supply chain disruptions. Yeah. It's going to increase inflation even more.
It's just going to make the economies much, much worse. I mean, I know that Greece, I don't think Greece could handle another lockdown, but it hasn't stopped them in the past. So
no.
Why would it stop them now? And Brian says add Gibraltar to that list. Yep. Davil says no happy ending there. And what else? Shifu Uginku says conservatism is the new counterculture. I agree with that.
Oh, absolutely.
Paul Joseph Watson did a really good video called "Conservatism is the New Counterculture."
That's a brilliant point, actually. I didn't know, but that is a brilliant point.
Yeah, and Degar says, here's a terrifying thought. Biden transfers power to Harris today while is under anesthesia for colonoscopy as part of his routine physical. Harris working from her office in the West Wing. Wouldn't Harris love that?
Absolutely.
Harris wants in. She wants that Oval Office bad.
Absolutely. As I said, they might. I think ultimately they will find some way of getting her out, but she'll leave kicking and screaming.
Yeah,
she's not going to go quietly.
She wants that presidency
Absolutely. Bad. Yeah,
really bad. Yeah, I agree with that totally. Where are we here? Let's see. Simon says COP, ESG, and Biden are causing global inflation, which will wreck developed nations and destroy third world ones.
Yeah. You're totally correct. Absolutely right. That's exactly what they're doing. They're wrecking third world nations. Sorry, they're disrupting, destabilizing developed economies. But of course, developed economies have some resources they can fall back on. People do to a certain extent. I mean, there's going to be very real hardship. I don't want to minimize the hardship that people are going to suffer. But in the global south, we are talking about, potential famine conditions in some places. And that's not over dramatic. Again, I was reading a report, a very serious report, very serious agency that said exactly that.
What countries do you think are most?
Well, the most exposed ones are in Africa always. Ethiopia, where of course there's a war, already seems to be heading that way.
Okay. I wish we had better news. Anyway, Brian, 10 euro super chat. Thank you very much, Brian. Simon says, how long before price and capital controls take their place alongside lockdowns?
Very good question. Very good question. And this brings me to another pet subject of mine, which is President Erdogan of Turkey, who, in the face of rising inflation, Turkey, exactly, has cut interest rates. Now, it's difficult to see how this can be sustained without imposing capital controls at some point. And I have to say that I do wonder whether Turkey will be the first country to do it. And it wouldn't surprise me at all. It's the sort of thing I can imagine him doing.
I've lived in two countries that have imposed capital controls, Alexander.
Greece and Cyprus.
Yeah. And capital controls for 6 months in both.
I know.
And it was awful.
Oh, no.
I remember going to you couldn't go to the ATM and pull out more than, like, at one point, it was 50 euros a week at one point, or like 100 euros a week in cash. You just couldn't, and you couldn't make any transfers anywhere outside of the country. Anywhere.
Anywhere.
Yeah.
I wasn't living in Greece at that time, but of course I remembered it. And I remember that it caused me problems in London because I couldn't take money out of Greece, and I couldn't get paid by people I'd done work for in Greece because there was just no way of doing it.
And the problem with capital controls is that, the politicians will say, yeah, we're only going to have capital controls for a week or two, but it's never the case. No. The capital controls, they last for months and months, if not years, and then you can finally get to a normal. Yeah, absolutely.
Then they're profoundly demoralizing. I mean, they really smash a country. Now, in Greece was at least plugged into the European Union. It's relatively small. What will happen if Turkey imposes capital controls? I don't know, but I can't see any other outcome given what Erdogan is doing. I mean, interest rates in Turkey are way now in the negative territory.
We've been covering it. Yeah.
Exactly. The central bank, I believe, far from having reserves, it's $35 billion underwater. It's a very eccentric economic theory that he has. And as I said, I can't see how it can end in anything else other than capital controls. The problem is, if Turkey imposes capital controls, in the kind of world we have today, it's entirely likely that others will follow.
Yeah, we've done dozens and dozens of shows on Turkey and the economic situation.
Yeah. Yeah.
Dozens over the past year. Simon says, Alex mentioned Diocletian, a Roman emperor who introduced price controls, required sons to follow their father's profession, and allowed families to sell children into slavery to pay taxes.
Absolutely. This is exactly what happened. And I mean, and of course, the one thing that didn't do is it didn't solve the inflation crisis. The Roman Empire at the time was in a severe inflation crisis. And Diocletian's attempts to he tried to fix prices, and he tried all kinds of things of this nature. And in fact, inflation continued. It didn't continue as before. It actually got worse. And what eventually overcame the inflation crisis in the late Roman Empire was that Constantine the Great, the emperor who converted to Christianity and who eventually made Christianity the official religion of the empire, he scrapped all of these controls, or at least he scrapped a lot of these controls, and he started to impose a very tight monetary policy, and he established a new currency, the solidus, which is based on gold, and that currency continued to function, believe it or not, in the Eastern Mediterranean all the way up to the 12th century. That's a pretty remarkable currency reform. But in the process, what that massive inflation did is that it led to enormous concentration of wealth in the hands of very small numbers of people. It impoverished the Roman middle class, and it set the scene for the empire's eventual collapse.
Yeah. First recorded hyperinflation.
Yeah.
Sentinel UK says Bitcoin has entered the chat. Yeah, all of the capital controls were before crypto as well. So it would be interesting to see what effect crypto would have now if a country decided to place capital controls. Keep in mind that Turkey has banned crypto, getting into crypto as well. So
not a coincidence, by the way. I would not be surprised at all if imposing capital controls is part of the underlying agenda here. I mean, if you're going to impose capital controls, then obviously you have to do something about crypto.
Yeah. Smash that like, everybody. We're almost at 1,000 likes. Like 25 more to go. Smash that like, please. Let's get to 1,000. Spread the word about this channel. Anatoly says here that Obama agreed to peace. We had war. Biden and Xi? ?
Well, that's right. I mean, I don't think that this summit, in my opinion, that's happened. It was very interesting. As I said, the Chinese used it, and this is what I discussed in this big video I did a few days ago. The Chinese used it as a showcase for the principles that underpin their foreign policy, and they used it also to respond to this latest project of setting up the summit of democracies as a counter to the summit of autocracies. So that was what they did, what he did. But it's not peace. It doesn't set up a framework for peace. In fact, the point about the summit is that nothing has actually changed. I mean, remember a couple of months ago, Biden met Putin in Geneva. There was a meeting in Geneva in June. There were some naive people who thought this was going to end the tensions between those two powers, the United States and Russia. And here we are, and we're in the winter just a few months later, and there's talk of war again. So it's that seems to be the default position. That seems to be the dominant narrative. We're being pushed towards conflict, certainly not towards reconciliation and peace.
Yeah, Sparky says here, restrictions delay virus natural transmission from more dangerous to less contagious to more contagious to less dangerous, more death and stalled economy. Well, the stalled economy, yeah.
It is a stalled economy. Now, as I said, Biden is saying, that all these problems were, these supply chain disruptions. So nothing to do with him. They're all about the fact that there are all these
everything magically appeared.
Exactly.
Magically occurred.
But obviously, if you start imposing restrictions and lockdowns and stop businesses functioning and things of that kind, you are inevitably going to exacerbate the supply chain disruptions. What you ought to do in that kind of situation, if you're going to do that, I'm talking now purely from achieving economic balance, is that because output is falling, you need to reduce the money supply to achieve some degree of balance. What the Democrats are doing is the opposite. They're increasing the money supply even more than it's already been increased. And it was already increased very much in 2020. And of course, inevitably, that's going to lead to the outcome that we see.
Yeah. Dan says they want a war as to eliminate the U.S. Constitution.
Well, I can see that. I mean, bear in mind that the periods when the U.S. Constitution has come under greatest threat, or at least its fundamental protections and liberties, have always been in wartime. During the Civil War in the 1860s, during the First World War, when the Espionage Act, for example, which is now being used against people like Julian Assange and other whistleblowers, when that was brought in, during the Second World War, obviously, if you want to dismantle the Constitution further, well, a war arguably provides you the way. But nobody should start a war for that reason. I mean, war is such a dangerous thing. I mean, nobody should actually start a war for a reason like that. The only reason for starting a war or for going to war is to defend yourself. That ought to be fundamental. And if you're starting to launch wars for that kind of reason, then you are inviting disaster upon yourself.
Do you think that there's truth to some of the statements that the reason the prosecution decided to press with the case against Kyle Rittenhouse, one of the reasons, I mean, I'm sure there's many, but one of the reasons was to delegitimize the Second Amendment?
I wouldn't be at all surprised. I'm pretty sure that there is that kind of agenda. Not just, I don't know about the prosecutors themselves, but the way some people are talking. I mean, I'm sure I'm sure that's part of the agenda that a lot of people are following. When I say a lot of people, I mean a major part of the American political class.
Yeah, because they say that a good functioning prosecutor's office would never have taken that case to court.
Well, I agree with that. I'm going to say something, though, which is, I think, a little bit more disturbing about that particular case, which is that given the nature of the case itself, given the facts, if there was a political imperative to bring a case, which perhaps there was, perhaps it's always a political prosecution, then all of the very disturbing things that have happened over the course of the trial, the very strange behavior of the prosecution, becomes explicable. Because if you're going to bring a political case, one which is not founded in law, then you're not going to be able to follow due process, to obey the judge's orders, to limit your approach to evidence, at least not in that kind of way, because then that means that your entire prosecution fails. The point I'm trying to make is it might not have been incompetence that drove the prosecution and the character of the prosecution. It might have been because it was always a political case which followed a political agenda.
Yeah. DJR says, I think so. It's against self-defense in the broader sense. And Turius says, in Hungarian, the soldier is called a home defender officially.
Oh, well, I didn't know that. I didn't know that.
Yeah. Excellent comments from the locals chat. And Heyman says, can Russia and China avoid proxy wars on their borders by threatening a two-front war?
Yeah, well, they have done. I mean, I think this is now implicit. I come back to this comment that Anatol Lieven is a sort of very, very, I think, very, very reliable, very well-sourced British journalist has said that when he met with the Russian leadership in Valdai, this is a big conference that happens in Moscow every year, they basically told him that there's a war in Ukraine in which the US becomes involved, then China will invade Taiwan. And that suggests to me some kind of mutual understanding by China and Russia to provide mutual support in that kind of situation. And that means a two-front war.
Yeah. Kurt says here, just want to wish all a great weekend. Thank you very much, Kurt. Great weekend to you as well. And Anatoly, Anatoly, who are Durham supporters, already did that one. Raul says, as a kid, I used to get my I did that one as well. Oh boy. I've lost my way here, Alexander, on the list. Amrit, this one I didn't do. Italy's real friends are in the East. The West are its real enemies who have never liked it. When China has bought a firm in Italy, they didn't take production away, but supported it. The West doesn't do so.
I'm sure that's right. Now, I don't know very much about Chinese attitudes to Italy and what Chinese feelings are towards Italy. I have no reason to doubt that they're friendly. But if you're talking about Russia, the Russians have an enormous sentimental attachment to Italy. I mean, and they've always liked the country. So, absolutely. I mean, they would be very well disposed to Italy indeed. And if Italy were to, I'm not saying realign, but pursue friendly relations with them, I think the Russians would entirely welcome that.
Yeah. Sparky says, once again, there'll be few, if any, dull moments with twins, Alexander.
Well, there are, believe me, there aren't now.
Yeah, very true. Let's see. A World Created says, happy weekend. Blue Diamond Jen says, excellent content, guys. I watch you individually too. Thank you very much for that, Blue Diamond. Jeb and Dan Noya says, the shift to electric cars is BS. Why? Batteries and the electrical grid. What happens when electric cars are sold in really large numbers?
Well, absolutely. I mean, I've heard lots of people talk about this, that at the present time, the electrical grids will simply not be able to cope with all of this. Now, I ought to say that our mayor in London, who is an individual called Sadiq Khan, whom I'm not going to express my opinions about, because if I did, even I would struggle to keep my language under control. But anyway, he is very, very keen on electric cars, and he's made it all but impossible for people to use diesels, at least in central London, and with taxis and all those sort of things. And he's trying to push everybody, and he's expanding the zone for electric car use all the time. And he's put pressure on Uber, which is putting pressure on his drivers to buy Teslas, the sort of high-end Uber drivers. So because I use Uber quite a lot, and because I'm the sort of person who talks to people quite easily and whom Uber drivers share my views about, I've been hearing an awful lot about electric cars, and there is enormous resentment about the way people are being strong-armed into them. And the general feeling is that they work all right in city environments, but for long-range journeys, and especially for motorway driving, they are simply not functional. Even cars like Teslas, which are designed to be, capable of long-range driving on motorways, I mean, they haven't been developed to the point where they can seriously match conventionally powered engines, conventionally powered cars. So if that is correct, and if the technology doesn't develop, the battery technology doesn't develop, it's not clear how it can develop on the basis of lithium ion, then what that essentially means is that the days of long-term touring in cars is coming to an end if we're all forced to switch to electric cars. I mean, you can drive them around town, and maybe you should, maybe it's a good thing, but you can't.
Convenient.
Exactly. You can't do what, by the way, I love to do, which is, to get into my car and go on a long intercontinental journey to say, from London to Berlin. That was my last drive, which was just before the pandemic restrictions came. I mean, that becomes much more problematic in a world of electric cars, unless, of course, there's a revolution in the technology. So the point about we can't really absorb them because of the grid, because that's impossible at the present time. There just isn't the means to do it. That I've heard many people say, and I'm sure that is true. But also, it would change completely the way we operate with cars in future. I mean, they would become an urban a purely urban transit phenomenon, not an intercity one. And of course, in countries with big distances, that would become a huge problem.
Yeah, but that is the plan. They don't want people driving long distances.
No,
I mean, they've openly said that.
No, absolutely. The other thing, of course, people complain about is that they're expensive. I mean, hybrid cars are affordable and can work quite well, but all electric cars are apparently expensive to run. And of course, I'm hearing lots of complaints from drivers that because there are very few charging points around London, they're being pushed into electric cars, and they have to get up at impossibly early hours of the morning to find the charging points. And even then, there's usually queues. So there's all kinds of issues about this.
Yeah.
But people still vote for Sadiq Khan, which is remarkable. I mean, he didn't win. He struggled to win in the last election, but he still has that support in North London from the, if you like, the sort of new Labour crowd. And, there's still enough people like that, apparently, to mean that he's pretty secure in his position as mayor.
Yeah, I've never understood his popularity, but anyway. No. Sparky says green tech may be okay for residential use, but its theoretical capacity falls far short of industrial needs. Modern nuclear is the safe answer.
Well, absolutely. But I mean, again, green people are the Green Party in Germany. I mean, people forget this. In 2011, it was basically it was evaporating. I mean, many of the people who had been previously green were becoming interested in this new left-wing party that was emerging at the time, which is Die Linke, which was originated in East Germany. It was the foundation was the East German Communist Party, but then it linked up with various left-wing groups in West Germany. It was beginning to look like an effective political force. And then Fukushima came along, and the Greens jumped onto Fukushima, and they were telling everybody, nuclear power is dangerous. We've got to do away with all the nuclear power stations. And they got what they wanted. And the result was that the Greens, ever since then in Germany, have gone from strength to strength. But they've pushed this anti-nuclear agenda. They are now so identified with it. I can't see how they can reverse course on it. In Germany, it explains why they are as popular as they are.
Yeah. Andrew says Trump's presidential emergency action documents. The Constitution provides a devolution option within continuity of government. A sting? Question mark.
Interesting question, but you see, again, this is a point of constitutional law about the United States. Given that I'm not even a U.S. constitutional lawyer, I can't really answer that. I mean, that's something that a constitutional lawyer could perhaps explain more thoroughly than I could do. Barack Obama, of course, is the great constitutional lawyer. Yeah. He no doubt has the answers to all of these questions. Yes.
Yeah. Should we ring him up? Should we give him a call?
We should.
In his Martha's Vineyard mansion and get him on the line, Barack.
Absolutely.
The great one.
I think what you would find is that he probably knows less about the U.S. Constitution and certainly cares less about it than we do.
Yeah, the great community organizer, Barack Obama. Thank you for that super chat, Andrew. Interesting question from Zarael. Hi guys, will Ghislaine? I always say Ghislaine. Will Ghislaine have a cold winter too? Her trial just started. Any news? And I have no new info on Klaus's alleged arrest in Cologne. Do you? I don't have any info on that. No. I can't confirm it.
No, I can't confirm it. I can't confirm. I mean, I'm not going to comment on it. But on Ghislaine, she's given a huge interview here, which has been all over British media, in which she's talking about what a terrible time she's having in prison, the medieval conditions she's having to experience, and very much an attempt to make herself appear the victim. And curiously and interestingly, at the same time, she was making out how, she's kept up her spirits. She teases the prison guards. She has sorts of games with them, all kinds of things. So, I mean, both the image that she's trying to present is of herself both as the victim and as this chirpy, heroic figure who's able to put and resist all the enormous pressures that are on her. I think this is going to be a very interesting trial. I've always felt that she was taking a huge risk by continuing to plead innocent, not guilty, right up to the trial itself. I always thought that she should do a deal. She's clearly not done it. Well, we'll see what the outcome is. The prosecution case, to my mind, from what I've seen of it at the moment, looks overwhelmingly strong.
And was it Boris Johnson's sister that said that Boris was hanging out with Ghislaine, or was it his sister?
Yeah.
Was it Ghislaine's?
She absolutely. I think so. And can I just say, I mean, lots of people have been hanging out with Ghislaine. I mean, when they talk about her as a socialite, she was that on steroids.
You see what a tight-knit group all of these people are.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
From Ghislaine to Boris to Clinton. I mean, it really is one group of people. In Greece, we call it a barea. It really is a tight-knit group of people.
I reckon that in London, it's a few thousand people altogether. Probably that might even be an exaggeration, actually. And that same group are connected with people in New York and Washington and San Francisco and the Beverly Hills, Hollywood part of LA. They're all part of the same world. And of course, it extends to France, to Paris. People don't realize the interconnections, the strength of the interconnections that there exist between all of these people. They go to the same shops, they meet each other, their children party in the same clubs. That's the world they live in.
Yeah. Amrit says here, severe punishment means the EU officials causing harm to Italy should be subjected by Italians to the great torture devices Italy engineered in medieval times.
Well, I am sure that's not going to happen. I mean, if they were brought to account purely by law, that would satisfy me. I don't think that's going to happen either. So I mean, that's the trouble. I mean, the best way to succeed in Europe today is to fail, and to fail corruptly. ask Christine Lagarde.
Yeah. The more you fail, the higher up you go. So, Zariel says the CCP told the people to stock up on food and essentials recently. Solar activity is low, and with power cuts, any winter could cause tremendous suffering. Did you hear about this?
I have heard about this. And again, and by the way, this is probably going to be bad for Xi Jinping personally, though at the moment he seems to be on a rising curve. He's power was confirmed by a Central Committee meeting in China a few days ago. But of course, he has been the great advocate in China of China converting to green energy and green policies. Now, there was a reason for this, and it was, believe it or not, very popular in China for a long time, because air pollution levels in Chinese cities were just off the scale just a few years ago. So he made his name by campaigning against all of this and saying, you know, we've got to clean up the atmosphere of our cities, and we've got to convert to a more green friendly type of energy mix. And the result is that the air in Chinese cities is much better, apparently, than it was, much better. But of course, these problems now are appearing all over the system because, again, the way China did it was that they didn't build nuclear power stations, which form a very small part of China's energy mix. They went heavily for renewables, which just very much like in Europe. And, well, they've got all the problems that flow from that.
Yeah. Digar says, Maxwell doing great in jail while Assange is suffering. Sarcasm. Yeah, absolutely. Great point.
It's not suffering. There's nothing there's not sarcasm. It's true. I mean, from her account, I mean, you know, you'd get the sense that, you know, on the one hand, prison is an ordeal, but it's also a big laugh. I mean, I'm not joking. You have to read the article to get a sense of what she's saying. Nobody who's had any dealings or access to Assange comes back and reports that he's experiencing anything else other than a terrible ordeal. He looks very, very ill. apparently at the last hearing, he looked awful.
Yeah. No, the sarcasm is, I am so happy. Happy Maxwell is doing great in jail while Assange is suffering.
Well,
Sarcasm. Yeah.
yeah.
It's interesting that you have Maxwell giving out these interviews.
Oh,
Maxwell giving out these interviews while Assange is going through what he's going.
Well, of course, and bear something in mind. I mean, she is in prison because she is charged in the United States with extremely serious crimes. Assange is in prison in Britain, though he is not charged with any crimes in Britain. And the British courts have refused the American request for his extradition. So he is in prison in Britain for no legal basis, on no legal basis that I can understand.
Yeah, that is the weird part about it all. Sparky says, go FBI, take the CIA with you. Sparky also says, Nerdtopia is dystopia.
Yeah, absolutely. Both true, by the way.
Yep. Mark Hewitt says, your reaction to the Church of England helping illegal immigrants like the Liverpool bombers stay in the UK?
Well, it doesn't surprise me in the slightest. I mean, you have many very well-intentioned and very good and decent and kind people in the Church of England. And some of them are, to be straightforward, are a bit unworldly. And I mean, I can say that because I've had numerous contacts with the Church of England and are led along. And others, of course, are very doctrinaire about these sort of things. And, you know, they do it because they share the same agendas as other people who are militantly anti-Christian about these precise things. So it doesn't surprise me at all. I mean, there's Christian charity, and that does sometimes lead people along strange paths.
Yeah. Paul Kofi, €2 super chat. Thank you very much for that, Paul. And Meganizia Shan says, live right in the center of the Bermuda Triangle in Southern Africa. Good men. Thank you, and evening, gentlemen.
Thank you very much,
Meganizia Shan, for that. And James Ferguson says here, the sweatshirt is comfortable, fit, and the coffee mugs work great. Happy holidays, guys. Yes, the sweatshirts are fantastic, and the mugs are great. Thank you very much, James.
They certainly are.
For that, to the Duran shop, you'll find the link down below. Didapunk says, note, when the media talks of the coof, they never break down the jabbed and the unjabbed. I had to change the words a little bit around, but
I know.
Yeah. Well, those words have those words have taken on completely different meanings than what they're probably intended to mean, Alexander. So
that's absolutely true. I repeat again what I was saying. This is not what most people thought at the start of this year. They were all told something quite different. And now what they see is that the light at the end of the tunnel that they were promised has receded away. And that is causing, I think, a lot of demoralization.
Yeah.
Perhaps that will lead to anger as well in due course. Probably it will.
Yeah, it will eventually. Yeah. Just the question is when. Divine Insurgent says, do you think there will be new travel restrictions by the new year? What are your predictions by the new year? That's an interesting
I think there will be. I am sure there will be. I mean, I can't see how there cannot be, given all the other things that are being done.
Yeah. There has to be. It's the natural progression of where they're moving towards.
Yeah.
I mean, we've seen it before play out 3 or 4 times already. Yeah. They start with, step by step, and eventually they reach the part of you can't travel here or there.
Exactly.
So we'll see. And it's always in the holidays. It's always around Christmas and Easter.
Mm.
Isn't that interesting? Always.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Pradeep Sangha says, is the Chinese economy bigger than the U.S. economy?
But if you calculate it on the basis of purchasing power parity, yes, is the short answer. In nominal GDP terms, no. The Chinese themselves still talk about themselves having the second biggest economy. I mean, I think people get very tied up in knots around this question. China has a much bigger manufacturing economy than the US does overall, but the US remains the much richer country. And that's perhaps, in terms of international weight, what really counts in terms of operating the financial systems. If you're talking about international trade, then it's different. Then the biggest manufacturer plays a big role.
Yeah. It's a world created, says in the super chat, good hunting. Thank you very much for that super chat. And Chris Banks here says that Robert Barnes was advertising the Duran mugs and boasting the channel on the Rekieta law the other day. Yes, I saw that, Alexander. I'm going to send you a link to that.
Oh, wow.
That had 100,000 plus concurrent viewers at one point, as they were talking about the they were doing a live stream of the Rittenhouse trial.
I know.
And the great Robert Barnes had one of our Duran mugs with the USA flag.
Wow.
And Viva asked him, "What's on your mug?" And everyone asked him, "What's on your mug, Robert?" And he said, "It's from the Duran." And he said very, very complimentary things.
Well, that was very kind of. Well, that was very kind of him. And can I just say, I mean, I'm a huge admirer of him, both as a lawyer, first and foremost, as a human being, and as a commentator too.
Yeah, definitely check out their channel.
I mean, on legal analysis, on legal issues, I mean, I find him absolutely outstanding. Actually, I mean, it is in fact a huge relief to talk to somebody who's able to talk about these subjects in a proper way. I mean, there are few people like him. In fact, perhaps there's only one person like him, and that's him.
Their channel, I believe it's vivabards.locals.com. If I'm not mistaken, is the link for that. And of course, Viva Fry has a great channel on YouTube as well.
Yeah.
So definitely check them out. And we'll do some more collaborations, but they're very, very busy with the
absolutely.
We're gonna let them handle that, and we look forward. I look forward to their shows on Rittenhouse every day, because they're just knocking it out of the park with their coverage on that.
Well, of course. Yeah. Well, can I just say, one of the things that they do is that they provide actual legal analysis. I mean, they tell us how this thing should be. They explain this. You don't get that in the media anymore. What you get in the media is something completely different. You get an exercise in fiction there, which is so corrosive, to put it simply.
I like to go to Viva's channel on YouTube as well, because I get like good insight on what's going on in Canada as well. I mean, he gives very, very good insight as to what's going on in Canada with lockdowns, with Trudeau, and all of that stuff. So I mean, you get really good news from him as far as Canada is concerned. So with the legal angle to it, because you know, he is a lawyer in Canada. So I mean, you get really good, reliable information from him there as well. Anyway, definitely great mugs, great channels. Check them out. And let's get back to the super chats. Paula De Beer says, "Thanks for all the digging." Thank you very much, Paula, for that. And Rich says, "The city of La Spiezza, Liguria, where the Automelaria is based, got the employees and even other people protesting heavily against the sale to foreigners."
Well, absolutely.
The company from the previous super chat. Yeah.
I mean, La Spezia is one of the great centers of the Italian Navy. I mean, there's a huge naval tradition there, and Automelaria produced the guns for Italian warships. So I mean, you understand the emotional connection. I mean, this is a sort of naval center, a bit like Portsmouth in Britain, for example. So it's completely understandable that the people there would be deeply upset and distraught about this. But then you get someone like Draghi, and he doesn't have these sentimental connections which are not even sentimental. He doesn't understand how important it is both to the society that that these companies should remain there, and how important it is ultimately to that company, because what will happen is that Automelaria, the brand, will continue, but of course the actual the techniques, the skills, the labor force, the designers, the engineers, they could be parceled out. They could be taken to France, Germany. They could be used in all sorts of things, all sorts of other people. The brand will lose its distinctiveness in that way. And this major manufacturer of guns and cannon, one of the most successful and important in the world, will gradually be eroded away. It will just become a label.
Yeah. Anatoly says, "If the EU Greens go down, Rosatom will flourish." Yeah, that's a good point.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, very good point. Yeah.
Well, paradox.
It's already flourishing, though, too, isn't it?
Absolutely, yeah. It is. It's one of the leading nuclear power engineering companies in the world, if not the leading nuclear power engineering company in the world. And I would say, well, this is the great paradox of it, because Chernobyl happened in the Soviet Union. The Soviets, the Russians, went the diametrically opposite way. Indeed, exactly.
People are talking about the camping bugs. Keep on going, Alexander.
Yes, they went the diametrically opposite way of what the West did. They didn't fall into sort of trap of doing away with nuclear power. They completely reorganized and reconstructed their entire nuclear power engineering industry in order to eliminate the kind of risks that gave rise to Chernobyl, and to develop it as far as possible at the very highest end, highest technological end. So it's interesting how the Russians went in the diametrically opposite direction.
Yeah. And everyone, if you want to watch the Rittenhouse trial, Alexander, I'm looking at the chat right now. Anyone that wants to get really great coverage of the Rittenhouse trial from the live feed, go to Requieta Law. People are putting it in the live chat. That's where you'll get really good live. And I mean, they stream for like 8 hours.
Yeah,
it's insane. Yeah, it's insane, but they do a great job. Sparky says, big city people may find 17-year-olds with the rifle strange, but in thousands of small communities across the U.S., 16 and 17-year-olds armed are expected to help in an emergency. 16 and 17-year-olds are expected to help in an emergency.
This has been pointed out to me. I mean, bear in mind, I'm British, where we have completely different attitudes to guns, and I live in London, which is not that kind of place. So, but I mean, this is, I think, the point. I understand the cultural difference, and I understand the sentiment, and I understand that things in the United States, in places like that, are done differently from the way that they are done in London. I don't expect everybody to live the way I do, because I understand that there's difference, and I respect that. The point with the setup we have today is that people don't tolerate that difference. They don't respect that difference or understand that others have different ways of living and of conducting their lives, and that it might work well for them, and that that's their right to.
Yeah. Simon says here, Rolls-Royce now has funding for its small modular reactors, the Merlin engine of the 21st century.
Quite possibly. We'll see. And Rolls-Royce, by the way, is one of the great engineering companies of the world. They're very heavily involved in, of course, aerospace, and we'll see what they achieve. And good luck with them. I mean, they don't. By the way, it's important to say they do not make Rolls-Royce cars. Rolls-Royce cars are made by BMW. They're two. They were separated. The Rolls-Royce engines, the aerospace company, the original actual Rolls-Royce, the company that was set up by Rolls and Royce, Charles Royce in particular, way back before the First World War. That is the company that builds aircraft engines, and which is now working on these types of nuclear reactors. It hived off its motor car division way back in the late 60s or early 70s, and it's now owned by BMW. And it's a great engineering firm, and I wish them well.
Yeah. Let's see. From locals, it says, Digar says, I started watching you because of Robert Barnes. Thanks, Robert. Thank you very much, Digar. Thank you, Robert, as well. And Mark says, found lots of great independent media folks through Barnes. Yes, absolutely. He supports independent media a bunch, and that's awesome. Requieta now has, at one point, had 111,000 viewers at one point. Requieta Law, 55,000 at this moment. And where am I here on this list? Larry says, Alex and Alexander, armed civil war in the U.S. in your lifetime? Yes or no?
I hope no. I don't want to foresee such an outcome, because I mean that would horrify me. I have to say we're closer to it than I ever imagined possible. And when I say closer to it, I think we are very close to it in some places. I mean, but I hope it doesn't. I hope that the United States does what it has always managed to do in the past, go right up to the edge and then pull back. I hope that's what happens again.
Davwell says, most of us in Oklahoma had a gun, at least from the age of 12. We used to take them to school in the gun rack in the back window. Also carried a knife on a belt.
Well, you see, this is it. I mean, in Britain, that would be considered extraordinary. In parts of the United States, it's entirely routine. It doesn't raise any eyebrows. It's seen as a constitutional right. It's very much bound up with the Republican and Democratic tradition. And it works. Who am I to say it shouldn't happen? That's the important point I want to make.
And in Arizona, I would see people would have guns all the time. It was no big. You didn't think about it after a while at all. It wasn't a big deal, to be quite honest. So yeah, the Merlin engine is still one of the great mechanical wonders of the 20th century. That comes from Mike.
Absolutely. For those who don't know, it was the aircraft engine that was developed by Rolls-Royce and which appeared on many British and American aircraft during the Second World War. The Spitfire definitely had them. I believe that some of the American planes might have had it too. I'm not sure whether the Mustang did, but maybe it did. Maybe it didn't. Yeah. I'm not sure.
Bugatti is 55% Croatian company. Bugatti.
Oh, is it? Didn't know that at all.
Didn't know.
No, God.
That's interesting.
Oh gosh, interesting. I thought Bugatti today was part of the Volkswagen group, but
yeah,
I might be wrong about that. Yeah.
Sparky says failing upward is nothing new. In the army in the 80s, we called it F up, move up. It was used. It was used because it was often easier to promote someone to get them out of the way than by other means. That's interesting.
There's a wonderful novel by Graham Greene. Many of you may know it, which is Our Man in Havana, who is this person who's recruited by the British to run the spy operation in pre-Castro Cuba. And of course, he's completely out of his depth and he doesn't know what to do. So he makes it all up. He fantasizes these giant spy networks. Eventually, the British authorities find out about what he's doing. So what do? They can't admit that he's made it all up because that would be a disaster. So they give him a promotion and an honor. And he rises up because he's successfully fantasized a successful spy operation in pre-Castro Cuba. And I mean, it does happen, but never as systemically as you see today, and as publicly as you see today. Ursula von der Leyen was the worst ever defense minister that Germany has ever had, apparently. I mean, she's universally derided as incompetent. Nobody likes her as a human being. When I say nobody, that's an extreme exaggeration. I'm sure many people.
Someone must like her.
Someone must like her. But politically, she's unpopular. And yet, what happens? You make her president of the European Commission. So I mean, she just goes floating upwards.
Yeah, all the way to the top. Let's see. Bugatti was in a merger deal with Rimac, the Rimac hypercar.
Interesting.
That's interesting.
Interesting. By the way, on the history of Bugatti, contrary to what many people think, was never an Italian car manufacturer. The original Ettore Bugatti, of Italian origin, his cars were made in Mulhouse, in Alsace, in France. There's a French manufacturer of cars in the interwar years. Very eccentric and idiosyncratic manufacturer. Very remarkable cars and very dangerous ones, apparently. So I'm told, even by the standards of the time.
From Simon, UK Skylon space plane, Rolls-Royce again is also moving forward. Eat your heart out, Elon and Bezos. Merlin used to fix Mustangs, P-51s.
Well, there you go. So the Merlin was used on the Mustangs. And thank you for that information, Simon. I mean, it's a great car company. And Charles Royce, who was its true founder, by the way, was a fascinating man. He was not a trained engineer. He always insisted that he was basically just a mechanic, but he was a very, very practical man, and he understood how to design cars to the point where they ran smoothly and perfectly, because he was incredibly meticulous in his design standards and in his production standards. And that tradition has carried over to Rolls-Royce ever since.
Yeah, read super chat. The justification of Draghi is that it would let Italy enter the French-German tank program when Italy has developed its own prototype, Iveco Automelata.
Oh, well, there you go. So, I mean, you sell off your most advanced gun company from crumbs in return for crumbs from the German-French table. Except, of course, the French will probably end up with the crumbs, and the Germans will end up with the cake.
Yeah, exactly. Cosmic Rain says, "I'm going to buy a third magic mug. Going to get the one with the Union Jack on it. Love your mugs, guys. Thank you, Cosmic Rain. The Union Jack. I've got a Union Jack mug. As do you, Alexander.
Absolutely. Of course I do. Yeah,
it's one of the great.
Not with me at the moment, but this one has. It's by that Greek designer. You can see it's got the Union Jack in a cup of tea.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, the Union Jack mug is very popular. It's a great mug. And Valley's super chat. Valley S has a super chat saying, "How about a glimpse of the baby girls? How is it being a daddy? How is it being a daddy, Alexander?"
Totally exhilarating, absolutely wonderful, rather tiring at the same time. Getting a glimpse of them, well, eventually, but they're they're rather small at the moment. They're only 3 weeks old.
I've got a question for you with regards to the twins. How is Michigan and
Solveig.
How's Michigan and Solveig reacting?
They adore them. They're with them all the time. They absolutely.
Were you worried about Michigan?
No. I mean, first of all, they're incredibly sweet, good-natured dogs. I mean, golden retrievers tend to be gentle dogs, friendly, intelligent, warm dogs. They're the perfect dogs to have children with, they just love them. They spend the night with them. I mean, we have them all. We're all together in the same room. And it's fine. There's no problem there at all. We were more worried because we also have 2 cats, by the way, and we were more worried about how they would react. And in the event they've been fine about the girls too. One of them has just kept a distance. The other cat has been quite inquisitive, but entirely friendly as well. So we've had no problems there of any sort. And as I said, the dogs are just delighted. And interestingly, they don't, want to touch them or lick them or anything of that kind. They come and sniff close up to them, but they seem to understand that they need to respect their distance. So we've had no concerns, no problems at all.
All right. Bugatti cars are $2 million for a basic.
Oh yeah, I mean, absolutely. This is. I mean, can I just say this is the roof? This is not. I mean, this is the same. This is. I mean, the original Bugatti. As I said, the company that was set up in Alsace by Ettore Bugatti and made this extraordinary cars, including the Bugatti Royale, which was the most expensive car of the interwar years. That company failed directly after the Second World War. Then, to the best of my knowledge, it was brought up by the Volkswagen Group, I believe by its Audi division. And then they relaunched it as this supercar company, making these extraordinary supercars. And I assume that Audi still owned it. And I think they are some of the most expensive cars in the world. I've seen 1 or 2 in my time in London. And given that London is a place where you see lots of supercars, I mean, the fact they've only seen so few tells you how exclusive they are.
Yeah, that is incredible. Dita Pug says, "Alexander, children cannot filter info. 30 minutes of play leads to 2 hours of sleep."
True. Absolutely. We've already found that out.
And Davwell in local says, "Just wait until they are dating, Alexander."
Oh yeah, I look forward to that day. I have to say.
And Dave Will says he's got a black lab, so everyone confirms that the labs are great.
Labs are wonderful dogs. We went for golden retrievers because, well, to be straightforward about it, they're a British breed, so. They're very similar to labs in personality, perhaps a bit quirkier, which appealed to me, less so to Catherine, I think. It appealed to me. And of course the breeding here is of a very high quality. So you can get extremely good golden retrievers here in Britain. And anyway, we love them, and they're amazing dogs.
Digar says, Alex, are the cafes still on strike in Greece? No, that was just one day. They're back to open again, but they still have the restrictions.
Yeah.
They're still following those restrictions.
Yeah.
So yeah. Let's see. Kurt says, when people say restrictions only for the unjabbed are okay, I wonder, don't know anything about World War II and how poor they will be without the unjabbed.
Well, indeed. Well, I mean, there's so much to say there. Again, one has to be careful, perhaps, what we do say. But I never thought to see a day when there would be restrictions like this reimposed in the West. But they have been.
They have been. Yeah. Simon, Skylon, first hypersonic bomber, Mach 20 plus.
Oh, my goodness.
Mach 20 plus.
My goodness. Simon, you're obviously up to speed with all of this. I confess I'm not. Thank you for letting us know.
Yeah. Let's see. I think that's everything, Alexander. Wow. Great questions. Mm-hmm. Great questions. Great comments.
Mm-hmm. And thanks. Chat. Indeed. As you've probably all figured out, by the way, from some of the answers, I'm something of a car buff, by the way, as well. So it's been marvelous to be able to talk about Bugattis and Rolls Royces and things of that kind. I should make it clear I've never owned one of either kind. But yeah.
I would be shocked if you had a Bugatti, Alexander. I don't know anybody that has a Bugatti. That's for sure.
I don't know anybody who's had a Bugatti. Yeah. I've known.
I don't even think I've seen one on the streets, to be honest.
No, as I said, I've seen. I mean, if you go to not so much Mayfair, but Kensington, Chelsea, those sorts of places, and some of the areas where, to be straightforward about it, you know, Middle Eastern people and Russian oligarchs have their houses. You occasionally see some incredible cars in London like that, but Bugattis are very rare because they're so expensive. They're so very expensive. They're very imposing cars, very, very striking cars, by the way.
That Bugatti had a factory in Italy, in Emilia Romagna, the center of supercars.
He did. That was right. Again, this is just a little. I mean, there was the original company, which was in Alsace in France. Then it was restarted by an independent group in Italy, and then, as I said, it was bought up, I think, by the I always thought it was the Volkswagen Group, Audi perhaps, but you know, it may be that things have evolved beyond that. But as it's just about the most exclusive car you can get now, at least a car from a major manufacturer. The other car you see in Britain, and you see more of them in London, and McLarens, and there's another sports car brand which does attract a customer base here in London, and you do see that a bit more often than you see Bugattis. As I said, I've only seen about two.
Yeah, Leafy Bug says I was a car buff, but then I had children. That's a good comment there. And Sparky Super Chat says dogs consider people dogs. Family is their pack.
I think that is exactly true. I think that's exactly right. I have to say though, I mean, you know, because Solveig and Mishkin are the first dogs I've lived with. He's always up to now had cats. I've always had cats, but Catherine was very keen on us having dogs, and you know, I was absolutely up for it. But you know, I am surprised at how family oriented dogs are, and how completely integrated they become with the family. Whereas cats always preserve a kind of distance. It's a completely different dynamic between them.
Yeah, Divine Insurgent Super Chat, is North Korea truly a pariah and rogue state? They don't have a central bank connected to an infamous family. Red Shield. Yeah.
well, they don't. I mean, they do have a central bank, and of course, the leadership is essentially dynastic, so far as I can tell. I mean, Kim Jong-un is the grandson of the founder of the state, who was Kim Il-sung, whose son, Kim Jong-il, was the successor and the father of Kim Jong-un. So, I mean, it's a dynastic setup. But is it a rogue state? Well, it's not as isolated as it was. I mean, it's patched up relations with China, as far as I can see. And it's even forged fairly good relations with Russia at the moment. So it's not quite as isolated as it used to be. Is it a rogue state? I think what I've heard from people who've been there is that it's obviously got its own policies and its own personality, and that can be a rather alarming and intimidating one. But what I've been told, and by a British diplomat who was there, is that the people who are in charge are actually pretty clever. So
yeah. All right, let's do a real quick chats on the live stream chat and on locals, and we'll wrap it up. Valley S says Dutch Hounds are my favorite dogs. Those are great dogs. And we'll do some car ones here. VW just buys the Rimac Grey P electric bikes company.
Oh, wow.
Where are we here? We have Leafy Bug says the Bugatti EB110 was my teenage dream before the McLaren F1 stole my heart. And Zariel says the VW Group, Alex, and Lamborghini is under the control of Audi, not BG.
Okay, well, there you go. I mean, thanks for all that information. I remember that Bugatti as well. I thought it was an extraordinary car. By the way, being British, of course, I was particularly, but living in Britain, I was particularly exposed to the McLaren, and I found that an enormously graceful car. By the way, beautiful.
Bugatti is owned by VAG, the Volkswagen Group. VW is one of my clients still today. Yeah.
Well, there you go.
Excellent. Yeah. All right, we'll leave it there. And another one. VW is owned 45% of Bugatti, Rimac 55%.
I see. That explains it. That explains it well. Okay.
That's the live stream, everybody. Wow. Covered a lot of topics.
We certainly have. Can I just say, I mean, it also shows the buoyancy of our community, that we start in darkness and end in exhilaration, talking about great cars and things like that. Where else would you find
from dark winter to $2 million Bugattis?
Bugattis, exactly.
Exactly. It's Sparky's last. This is the last super chat coming in from Sparky. It's a great one to end the live stream, Sparky. So I thank you for this one. When twins are dating age, Alexander may need to move his family to the US so he can have a shotgun. All right, Sparky, bringing it home. Thank you very much, everybody, for a great live stream. Thank you to everyone in locals as well. Great questions, great comments. The Jaguar XJ220 was crazy insane. Yes.
No,
cool car. Yep. Let's see. Cosmic Rain. Thank you very much, moderators. Cosmic Rain, Valley S, Zariel, Alan Watson, Reckless Abandon. Who else? Did I miss anybody? I don't think I missed anybody. Thank you very much for moderating. And let me just go through and make sure I got everybody. And check out also durantv.com, where you can see all our videos. Just plays 24 hours a day. Check that site out, durantv.com. I'll be promoting it as well on the community page of our video platforms and on locals as well. I'll put the link there. So check that out. And Spartan Warrior Queen, of course. Spartan Warrior Queen, a great Spartan Warrior Queen as well. Did I miss anybody? Let me know. I don't think I missed anybody else. I'm going through. I'm scrolling through just to make sure I got everybody. Yes, I got everybody. All right. Final thoughts, Alexander, before we sign off?
Well, as I said, let's see how we get through this winter. You know, strangely enough, if we get through the winter in one piece, perhaps things will start to get together in the spring. People start to get more hopeful. Maybe there'll be more pushback. I tend to agree with you that the big events will happen in the United States. United States remains the center of the world system. China makes big moves. Russia makes big moves. The US changes everything, and it can do so very quickly.
Yeah. Sparky's super chat here says, to dogs, humans are superior dogs. To cats, humans are inferior cats.
True enough.
Very true.
True enough.
On that thought, we will sign out. Take care, everybody. Have a great weekend. And tomorrow we will be having another history show coming up tomorrow as well. So keep an eye out for that. Take care.